A dead man's Harley sits chained to a flatbed trailer rolling through the worst part of Ashland, California. The engine hasn't turned over in 41 days. Every mechanic who's touched it has failed. And the Outlaw Motorcycle Club that owns this machine has given one final order: bring it back to life by Friday morning, or the garage that failed them will cease to exist. But here's what nobody expects. In the back of that garage, hiding in the shadows for 19 days straight, an 8-year-old boy has been watching, waiting, and the secrets locked inside his head, secrets that died with his father on a rain-soaked highway 14 months ago, are about to change everything, because this boy knows things about that motorcycle that no living person should know. And once he opens his mouth, there is no going back. Before we ride into this one, I need you to do something for me. Smash that like button, drop a comment, and tell me what city you're watching from right now. And whatever you do, stay until the very end, because this story doesn't just hit hard, it breaks you open. Let's go. The heat arrived before the sun did. By 6 in the morning, the air above Ashland's industrial corridor was already shimmering. Thin, mean waves of California heat rising off asphalt that hadn't cooled since April. The kind of heat that warped metal, blistered paint, and made men do things they'd spend the rest of their lives regretting. Stray dogs slept under dumpsters. Pigeons sat motionless on power lines with their beaks open, panting. Even the wind had given up, leaving behind a stillness so heavy it felt like the sky was pressing down on the city with both hands. Nothing moved on Industrial Row. Then the sound came. Low at first. A rumble so deep it vibrated in the chest before the ears could register it. The kind of sound that didn't announce itself. It invaded. It crept through concrete walls and steel doors and settled into the bones of every person within a quarter mile. And it said, without words, without negotiation, something is coming and you are not ready. 12. Harley Davidsons turned onto Industrial Row in a staggered formation tight enough to touch. Chrome flashed under the early sun. Exhaust pipes breathed blue smoke into the dead air. The engines didn't scream. They growled, patient, restrained, heavy with purpose. This was not a joyride. This was not recreation. This was a procession, and every rider in the pack understood that the line between procession and funeral was thinner than the throttle cable vibrating beneath their right hands. At the center of the formation rode Jim Mercer. He was 47 years old and looked like a man the decade had chewed on and spat back out with teeth marks still visible. A scar ran from his left temple to the hinge of his jaw. A crooked, ropey line of dead skin, courtesy of a knife that should have killed him in a bar parking lot outside Bakersfield 8 years ago. His knuckles were flat. His forearms were mapped with faded tattoos that told stories he never told out loud. His leather cut, black, cracked, sun-bleached at the shoulders, bore the insignia of the Iron Reaper's MC, a winged skull biting down on a piston. The threads worn so smooth the image looked like it was sinking back into the leather. Jim didn't wear sunglasses. He didn't squint against the sun. He stared straight ahead with pale gray eyes that gave away absolutely nothing. Not anger, not grief, not the fact that he hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night since the phone call 41 days ago that ended the only version of family he had ever understood. Dutch Sullivan was dead, heart failure, alone. 2 in the morning on the floor of a single-wide trailer with a television playing to no one and a half-empty bottle of bourbon on the counter and a dog asleep on the porch who didn't bark because the dog had been deaf for 2 years, and Dutch never told anyone because admitting the dog was old meant admitting he was old, and admitting he was old meant admitting that time was winning, and Dutch Sullivan never admitted defeat to anything. Not to the law, not to rival clubs, not to the 3 bullets still lodged in his lower back from a shooting in 1994. So he died the way he lived, silently, stubbornly, without asking a single person for help. Jim had found the body. He didn't talk about that. He would never talk about that. What he carried from that trailer, the image of Dutch's hand still reaching toward the phone on the kitchen counter, fingers curled like he'd been trying to call someone in the last seconds. Maybe Jim, maybe no one, maybe just reaching for something to hold. That image lived behind Jim's eyes now like a photograph nailed to the inside of his skull, and it was the first thing he saw every morning and the last thing he saw every night, and he had accepted, with the cold practicality of a man who'd survived things that should have killed him, that this image would be with him until he died. The club hadn't grieved, not publicly. Grief was a luxury that outlaw motorcycle clubs couldn't afford because grief looked like weakness, and weakness attracted predators. And predators in this world didn't file lawsuits. They showed up at 3 a.m. with baseball bats and gasoline. So the Iron Reapers did what they always did. They swallowed it. They rode. They kept formation. They locked their jaws and hardened their eyes and waited for the pain to calcify into something useful. Rage, or loyalty, or whatever it is that fills the space inside a man when sadness isn't allowed to stay. But the bike. Dutch's bike was different. Strapped to the flatbed trailer at the rear of the convoy, held down by ratchet straps and padded with moving blankets that were already soaked with dew, sat a 1986 Harley-Davidson FXR that hadn't run in over a year. The chrome was corroded. The paint had oxidized to a flat, lightless black. The leather seat was split down the center like an old wound that nobody had stitched. The tires were soft. The chain was stiff with rust. But the frame was straight. And the engine, that impossible hand-built Frankenstein engine that Dutch had assembled over 3 years from parts scavenged, borrowed, stolen, and machined by hand in a garage that no longer existed. That engine was still there, still intact, still holding the mechanical fingerprint of a man who built motorcycles the way some men wrote music, not by the rules but by something deeper, something instinctive, something that couldn't be taught or replicated or found in any factory service manual ever printed. Jim had made Dutch a promise, 11 months before the heart attack. Sitting on Dutch's porch, both of them watching the sun disappear behind the refinery stacks on Ashland's west side, drinking beer from cans that were getting warm because neither of them cared. Dutch had nodded toward the FXR parked under a canvas tarp in the dirt yard and said, quiet, almost embarrassed, like a man confessing something he shouldn't need to confess, "When I'm gone, don't let her rot." Jim had looked at the bike, then at Dutch, then back at the sky. "All right," he'd said. That was it. No handshake, no ceremony, just a word between two men who understood that a word, in their world, was heavier than any contract. Now Dutch was dead and the bike wouldn't start, and Jim was breaking the only promise he'd ever made to the only man who had ever treated him like something worth keeping alive. The memorial ride was Saturday morning. 47 Iron Reapers riding from the clubhouse to the coast, Dutch's FXR leading the pack. It was non-negotiable. It was the last honor. It was the only thing that mattered this week, this month, this year. And the bike had been sitting in a garage on Industrial Row for 19 days, dead as the man who built it. The convoy pulled into the gravel lot in front of Apex Ironworks, and the engines died one by one, each silence heavier than the last. Apex Ironworks was the kind of building that existed only because nobody had bothered to tear it down. Concrete block walls stained with decades of grime, a corrugated steel roof patched in 3 places with mismatched metal, a roll-up door that stuck halfway and had to be kicked from the inside. Above the door, a neon sign buzzed and flickered with half its letters dead, a EIRNWRKS. The parking lot was cracked gravel and oil stains. A dumpster overflowed near the fence. The whole place smelled like forgotten industry, rust, diesel, hot metal, and the slow decay of a business that had been dying for years without the dignity of an official funeral. Jim dismounted and stood in the lot with his back to the building for a long moment. He didn't look at the other riders. He didn't issue instructions. He just stood there, facing the street, watching the heat waves rise from the asphalt, letting the silence do what silence does in moments like this. Compress time, sharpen focus, make every sound that follows feel like it matters more than it should. Then he turned and walked toward the door. His boots hit gravel. Each step sounded deliberate, controlled, like a man counting down from a number only he knew. Inside, the garage smelled like a place where hope had come to die. Stale coffee. Cigarette smoke layered so thick it had become architecture. Gasoline fumes. The sour electrical smell of fluorescent tubes that needed replacing. 2 of the 6 overhead lights were dead, casting the workspace in a sickly amber half-glow that made everything look jaundiced. The tools, the walls, the faces of the men standing near the center bay with their hands hanging at their sides like they didn't know what to do with them anymore. Rusty Delano stood closest to the dead motorcycle. He was 54, thin in a way that had nothing to do with exercise and everything to do with meals replaced by coffee and worry. His gray ponytail was unwashed. His fingertips were stained the permanent yellow-brown of a three-pack-a-day man. His coveralls hung loose at the shoulders. 22 years ago, he'd opened this garage with a bank loan and a reputation as one of the sharpest Harley mechanics on the Central California coast. The reputation was true then. The bank loan had become a second mortgage. The reputation had become a rumor. And the garage was 93 days behind on rent, a fact that Rusty kept in the same mental drawer where he stored every other thing he couldn't fix. He had been working on Dutch Sullivan's FXR for 19 days. 19 attempts. 19 failures. Beside him stood Danny Cho, his senior mechanic, 36, stocky, Korean-American, arms sleeved in black and gray tattoos, permanent dark circles under his eyes from years of working doubles and sleeping on the shop floor during busy seasons that weren't busy anymore. Danny was good, maybe the best wrench Rusty had left. But even Danny had started going quiet this week. And when Danny went quiet, it meant he was out of ideas. And when Danny was out of ideas, there were no more ideas. Coop leaned against the far wall. Lanky, red-haired, mid-20s, a grease smear on his forehead that he'd stopped bothering to wipe off 3 days ago. He was staring at the FXR with the empty expression of a man watching a fight he already knows he's going to lose. The door opened. Sunlight flooded in. Then Jim's silhouette filled the frame, blocking the light completely, and the temperature in the room changed. Not in degrees, but in density, in pressure, in the way every man present suddenly became aware of his own breathing. Rusty. One word, no inflection. Jim's voice was flat the way a blade is flat, all edge, no depth. The kind of voice that didn't need to rise because it never had to compete with anything. Rusty turned around. He opened his mouth and for half a second nothing came out, which was half a second too long in front of a man like Jim Mercer. Jim, we've been... Look, I need to explain something. I didn't come here for explanations. The battery drains overnight, every time. I've replaced the regulator, rewired the charging circuit, checked every ground strap on the frame. It's clean. It all checks out. But the battery's dead by morning, every single morning, and the timing, Jim, the timing is wrong. Not wrong like it slipped, wrong like it was set wrong on purpose. The marks don't line up with anything in the service manual. The cam profile doesn't match any Harley spec I've ever seen. The bore is non-standard. The compression ratio is, I don't even know what to call it. It's like Dutch built this engine in a language that doesn't have a dictionary. Jim stepped inside. His shadow preceded him across the concrete floor. You had 19 days. I know. You had every tool in this building. I know. You had 2 mechanics helping you around the clock. I know that, Jim. And the bike beat you. Rusty didn't answer. He didn't have to. His face was the answer, drawn, gray, hollowed out by 19 nights of 3-hour sleep and the slow, grinding humiliation of losing to a machine. The memorial is Saturday, Jim said, and now his voice carried something underneath the flatness, something deeper, something that sounded like a man trying very hard not to break a thing he valued. 47 bikes. Dutch's FXR leads the formation, or the formation doesn't ride. That's not a preference. That's not a suggestion. That is the only thing holding this club together right now. He let the sentence sit. Fix the bike by Friday morning, or I find someone to take over this shop, and I'm not talking about a new lease. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The radio in the corner murmured something nobody was listening to. Outside, a truck horn blared on the highway overpass and faded into nothing. Jim turned and walked out. His boots echoed against the floor in slow, measured impacts that sounded like a clock counting down. The door closed. Sunlight disappeared. The garage returned to its sickly amber twilight. Danny exhaled hard through his nose. That's it then. Coop pushed off the wall. What do we do? Rusty sank into a metal folding chair near the workbench. He put his head in his hands. His fingers were trembling. Not from fear, from exhaustion so deep it had started eating into his coordination, his focus, his ability to separate rational thought from the noise of panic that had been building in his skull for 19 days straight. I don't know, he said. I don't know what else to try. Nobody answered, because there was nothing to say. 3 men stood inside a failing garage, staring at a dead motorcycle that belonged to a dead man, knowing that their livelihoods and possibly their safety depended on making it breathe again by tomorrow morning. That was when the sound started. Quiet, almost invisible, a soft rhythmic scraping, bristles against concrete. Coming from the back of the shop, beyond the parts racks, beyond the stacked tires and forgotten inventory bins and the narrow corridor that led to the storage area nobody had used in years, somebody was sweeping. Danny's head snapped toward the sound. The hell is that? Coop reached for a wrench on the bench. Old habit, reflex. The kind of instinct you develop when you work in a neighborhood where people break into garages for copper wire and catalytic converters. Rusty looked up from his hands. Nobody's supposed to be back there. Danny grabbed the flashlight off the pegboard and moved toward the corridor. Coop followed. Their footsteps were cautious, deliberate, the way men walk when they don't know what they're walking toward, but suspect they won't like it. The flashlight beam cut through the dust and landed on a figure near the floor. Small. Very small. A boy stood between 2 rows of metal shelving, holding a push broom with a wooden handle nearly twice his height. He was sweeping the concrete with careful practiced strokes, the kind of repetitive precision that suggested this wasn't the first time and wasn't an accident. He was maybe 8 years old, maybe less. Hard to tell with children who don't eat enough. He was thin, the way poverty makes children thin. Not skinny, not angular, but diminished, reduced, as if his body had learned to take up as little space as possible, because the world kept telling him there wasn't room. His t-shirt was faded gray and too large, hanging past his elbows. His jeans were cuffed 3 times at the ankles. His sneakers were held together with something that might have been duct tape. His dark hair was clean but uncombed in the back, combed carefully in the front, the work of a child who dressed himself while his mother was already gone for the day. His face stopped Danny cold. Not because the boy looked scared. He didn't. Not because the boy looked lost. He wasn't. But because the boy's face, those dark brown eyes, that hard little jaw, that expression of exhausted seriousness that no 8-year-old should be capable of wearing, looked exactly like someone Danny had seen before. Someone who used to stand in this exact garage, in this exact corridor, pulling parts from these exact shelves. "Kid," Danny said. His voice had gone strange. "Who are you?" The boy stopped sweeping. He looked up at Danny and Coop and then past them at Rusty, who had appeared at the edge of the corridor with his arms crossed tight against his chest. "I'm Leo," the boy said. "Leo who?" The boy's eyes moved to the motorcycle visible through the gap between the shelving units. Dutch's FXR, sitting under the dead fluorescent lights, like a monument to failure. "Leo Hayes," he said. The name detonated in the room without a sound. Rusty's arms dropped. Danny took a step backward. Coop's wrench hand went slack. "Hayes. Arthur Hayes? Dead 14 months. Route 112. Rainstorm. 11 at night. Blown rear tire on a 2003 Sportster doing 55 in the dark." The guardrail caught him at the waist. The coroner's report was 2 pages long and didn't mention that Arthur Hayes had been riding home from a second job he'd taken because the shop had cut his hours to part-time 6 months earlier because the shop was dying and couldn't afford to keep him. Arthur Hayes had been Dutch Sullivan's mechanic. Not just a mechanic. The mechanic. The only person on Earth who understood the impossible machines Dutch built. When Dutch welded parts together that shouldn't fit, Arthur made them fit. When Dutch machined engine components by hand with tolerances that existed nowhere in any factory specification, Arthur tuned them until they ran like living things. They had worked together for 19 years. Dutch inside the club, Arthur outside it. No patch. No colors. Just a quiet man with oil-stained hands and a gift so specific it had no name. Showing up before dawn and leaving after dark, 6 days a week, for almost 2 decades. Arthur had never asked the club for anything. Not money, not protection, not even recognition. He came, he worked, he went home to his wife and his son, and he lived a life so small and so invisible that when he died on a highway at 11 o'clock at night, it took 14 hours for anyone to notice he was gone. And now his son was standing in the back of Apex Ironworks, with a push broom and a pair of eyes that carried his father's face like an accusation. "How long have you been in here?" Rusty asked. His voice was barely above a whisper. 19 days, Leo said. The same number, 19. The exact number of days since Dutch's FXR had arrived at the shop. "Where have you been hiding?" Leo pointed upward. Above them, a rusted metal catwalk ran along the upper wall of the garage near the ventilation ducts. A maintenance walkway. Condemned by the building inspector 2 years ago. Rusty hadn't been up there since. "You've been sitting up there? Watching us? For 19 days? "Listening," Leo said. Not watching. Listening. The distinction mattered, and every man in that corridor felt it matter. "Does your mother know you're here?" "She works mornings at the hospital laundry. I take the bus. She thinks I go to the after-school program." Rusty closed his eyes. The math hit him in a place he didn't expect. Not in his head, where problems were solved, but in his gut, where guilt lived. An 8-year-old boy riding a city bus alone to a condemned garage to sit on a rusted catwalk in the dark, listening to grown men fail at the one thing his dead father could have done with his eyes closed. For 19 days. In silence. Without telling anyone. "Why?" Rusty asked. "Why didn't you say something?" Leo looked at him with those terrible, steady eyes. "I wanted to see if you could figure it out." "Figure what out?" "What's wrong with Dutch's bike?" Danny and Coop exchanged a glance. Rusty uncrossed his arms slowly. "And can you?" Rusty asked, and he heard the absurdity of the question as it left his mouth. A 54-year-old mechanic with 22 years of shop experience asking an 8-year-old child if he could diagnose a motorcycle that had defeated every professional who had touched it. Leo set the broom against the shelf. He walked forward, past Danny, past Coop, through the corridor and into the main workspace with the quiet, unrushed gait of someone who knew exactly where he was going and had been waiting a long time to go there. He stopped in front of the FXR. He looked at it the way you look at a grave you've visited so many times, the grief has worn down into something harder. Something with edges. Something that cuts but doesn't bleed anymore. "You're checking the wrong timing marks," he said. Rusty blinked. "What?" "The timing marks on the cam cover. You're reading factory specs." Dutch never used factory specs. Not once. He advanced the timing 12 degrees on everything he built. Said it gave the engine a heartbeat. There's a hand-filed notch on the inside of the primary cover. You can't see it unless you pull the cover completely. That's the real mark. My dad showed me. Nobody breathed. "And the battery," Leo continued. His voice was level, precise, mechanical. A child delivering information with the clinical accuracy of an engineer and the emotional detachment of someone who has practiced saying these things in the dark so many times the words have lost their warmth. "There's a secondary ignition circuit. Dutch wired it under the seat pan with a toggle switch hidden behind the gas tank. When the toggle's off, the bypass creates a parasitic draw, drains the battery in about 6 hours, every time. You have to switch the toggle before you do anything else." Rusty moved to the FXR. He crouched beside the gas tank. His fingers searched the underside of the frame and stopped. A small metal toggle, recessed into a bracket. Invisible unless you knew it was there, exactly where Leo said it would be. Rusty stayed crouched for a long time. His hand rested on the hidden switch. His other hand gripped the edge of the workbench, knuckles white. When he finally looked up at Leo, his eyes were wet and his voice was wrecked. "Your father taught you this." It wasn't a question, but Leo answered it anyway. "Every night," he said, "before I went to sleep. Other kids got stories about dragons and castles. I got cam profiles and ignition timing. My dad said Dutch's bikes were poems written in steel. And if you couldn't read the poem, you didn't deserve to start the engine." The boy's voice didn't waver. His face didn't crack. He delivered those words with the stillness of someone who had cried every tear he had in private and arrived here today with nothing left to spill. An 8-year-old boy who had turned his grief into expertise and his loneliness into patience and his father's memory into a mechanical language he carried inside him like a second heartbeat. Danny turned away and pressed his wrist against his eyes. Coop stared at the floor and swallowed hard enough that the sound was audible. Rusty stayed crouched, one hand on the toggle switch, one hand on the bench, looking at this boy like he was looking at something he'd broken and didn't know how to fix. But beneath the grief, beneath the shock, beneath the impossible reality of an 8-year-old child who carried a dead mechanic's knowledge like an inheritance nobody knew existed, something else was forming. A thought, a fear, a question that none of them said out loud because saying it would mean acknowledging a truth that was bigger than a broken motorcycle. Leo knew Dutch Sullivan's secrets, the hidden circuits, the non-standard builds, the engineering language that existed nowhere except inside Dutch's head, and apparently inside bedtime stories told to a small boy by a father who wouldn't live long enough to see his son use them. That knowledge, in the world of the Iron Reapers, was not just mechanical information. It was club intelligence. It was history encoded in steel. It was the kind of thing that made people valuable, and valuable people in this world became targets. And once Jim Mercer learned that Arthur Hayes' son was standing inside Apex Ironworks, reciting Dutch Sullivan's engineering secrets from memory, this boy's life would never be the same. Rusty looked at Danny. Danny looked at Coop. The same thought passed between all three of them like a cold wind through an open door. "We need to call Jim," Danny said quietly. Rusty's jaw tightened. He looked at Leo. This undersized, underfed, fatherless child standing in front of a dead legend's motorcycle with nothing but a pair of worn-out sneakers and a head full of secrets that could save a garage, honor a dead man, and paint a target on his back all at the same time. "Yeah," Rusty said, "we do." But he didn't reach for the phone. Not yet. Because something in his chest, something old and broken and heavy, something that felt like the memory of every person he'd ever failed to protect, including Arthur Hayes himself, was telling him that the moment he made that call, he was handing this boy to a world that wouldn't see a child. It would see a tool, a key, a ghost. And ghosts, in the world of the Iron Reapers, didn't get to choose what happened next. Leo stood perfectly still in the amber half-light of the dying garage, one hand resting on the cracked leather seat of Dutch Sullivan's motorcycle, his face reflected in the dull chrome of the gas tank. Small, serious, unaware that the words he had just spoken were about to pull him into a world his father had spent a lifetime keeping him away from. Outside, across Ashland, Jim Mercer's phone sat on the seat of his Harley, face up, screen dark. It wouldn't stay dark for long. The phone call lasted 11 seconds. Rusty stood in the narrow hallway between the shop floor and the bathroom that hadn't had running hot water since March, holding his cell phone against his ear with a hand that smelled like gasoline and regret. Danny leaned against the doorframe behind him, arms crossed, watching with the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't see the bottom of. "Jim, it's Rusty." "I know who it is. You need to come back to the shop." Silence. 3 seconds of it. In Jim Mercer's world, 3 seconds of silence was a complete interrogation. "Why?" "There's a kid here. Arthur Hayes' boy." The line went dead. Rusty looked at the phone. Call ended. No goodbye, no question, no clarification. Just the empty hum of a disconnected line and the knowledge that Jim Mercer was already on his bike. "How long you think we got?" Danny asked from the doorway. 8 minutes, maybe less." "What do we do with the kid?" Rusty turned around. Through the corridor, he could see Leo still standing in front of the FXR, one hand resting on the cracked leather seat, his small body perfectly still in the amber light. The boy hadn't moved since Rusty walked away to make the call. Hadn't asked what was happening. Hadn't asked who Rusty was calling. He just stood there with his hand on the dead man's motorcycle, like he was keeping a promise nobody else could hear. "We don't do anything with him," Rusty said. "He's not a part. He's not a problem to solve. That's not what Jim's gonna see." "I know what Jim's gonna see." "Then you know we got about 7 minutes to figure out how to keep this kid from getting swallowed whole." Rusty didn't answer. He walked back to the shop floor, pulled a metal stool from beneath the workbench, and set it down 3 feet from Leo. "Sit," he said. Leo looked at the stool, then at Rusty. "I'm fine standing. Kid, in about 6 minutes, a man is going to walk through that door who makes every other scary thing you've ever seen look like a cartoon. I need you sitting down, looking calm, and not saying a single word until I tell you it's okay. Can you do that?" Leo studied Rusty's face for a moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not fear, not obedience, but calculation. The look of a child who had learned through months of navigating a world that didn't care about him, how to read the weight of a room and position himself accordingly. He sat on the stool. "Good," Rusty said. "Now, listen to me carefully. When Jim gets here, he's going to ask you questions. Answer them. Don't volunteer extra. Don't show off. Don't try to impress him. Just answer what he asks and nothing more. Understood?" "Why?" "Because the more you know, the more valuable you become. And in Jim's world, valuable things don't get left alone." Leo's eyes didn't waver. "My dad was valuable to them. They left him alone plenty." The sentence hit Rusty in the sternum like a fist wrapped in barbed wire. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out that would have been adequate, so he just stood there, gutted by the quiet accuracy of an 8-year-old boy who understood exactly what kind of men he was dealing with. And what kind of men had let his father die. Danny shifted in the doorway. Coop, who had been organizing tools with the nervous energy of a man who needed his hands busy, stopped and looked at the floor. Nobody argued with the boy, because nobody could. 6 minutes passed in a silence so heavy it felt like the shop was underwater. Leo sat on the stool with his hands on his knees, back straight, feet not quite reaching the floor. Rusty stood near the workbench, pretending to sort through a drawer of gaskets while his mind raced through scenarios, each one worse than the last. Danny stayed in the doorway, smoking a cigarette down to the filter and immediately lighting another. Then the sound came. Not 12 bikes this time, just one. A single Harley engine approaching from the east end of Industrial Row, growing louder with each second, the exhaust note unmistakable. The deep, uneven potato of a modified V-twin with straight pipes and no muffler. The sound filled the street. It filled the building. It filled the space between heartbeats. The engine died in the gravel lot. Boot heels hit ground. Footsteps approached. Slow, deliberate, measured, each one landing with the precision of a man who never wasted a movement. The side door opened. Jim Mercer stepped inside and the room contracted around him. Not physically, but spatially, atmospherically, in the way that certain men compress every environment they enter until there is no air left for anyone else. He was still wearing the same leather cut, the same flat gray expression, the same scar tissue across his jaw. But something in his eyes had changed. Something behind the emptiness had caught fire. Not rage, not yet, but the precursor to rage, the chemical moment before ignition when the fuel and the oxygen have mixed but the spark hasn't landed. His eyes found Leo immediately. He stood in the doorway for 5 full seconds, staring at the boy on the stool. His jaw muscles worked beneath the scar. His right hand, hanging at his side, opened and closed once, a gesture so small that only someone watching for it would have noticed, and Rusty was watching for it. "That's him," Jim said. Not a question. "Yeah," Rusty said. Jim walked forward. His boots on the concrete sounded different now, slower, heavier, as if each step was carrying weight that hadn't been there an hour ago. He stopped 6 feet from Leo and looked down at the boy the way a man looks at a locked door when he's not sure he wants to know what's on the other side. Leo looked up at him. And here was the thing that changed the room, the thing that Danny would talk about later, quietly, over a beer, in a voice that still sounded rattled weeks afterward. The boy didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't shrink into himself the way any normal child would when confronted with a man like Jim Mercer. Leo just looked up at him with those steady, too old brown eyes and waited, like he'd been expecting this moment, like he'd been preparing for it. "You're Arthur's boy," Jim said. "Yes, sir. You've been hiding in this shop." "I wasn't hiding. I was watching." "For how long?" 19 days. Jim's jaw tightened. 19 days. The same 19 days he'd been losing sleep, losing patience, losing the battle to honor a dead man's last wish. This child had been here the entire time, sitting on a condemned catwalk above their heads, listening to them fail. "And you know what's wrong with the bike? I know some of it. Some of it. The parts I know are the parts my dad taught me. There might be things Dutch did that my dad never saw. I can't know what I don't know." Jim studied the boy for a long time. His expression didn't soften. Softening wasn't something Jim Mercer's face was designed for, but something behind his eyes recalibrated. A reassessment. The kind of adjustment a man makes when the thing in front of him turns out to be fundamentally different from what he expected. "Show me," Jim said. Leo slid off the stool. He walked to the FXR and stood beside it, his head barely clearing the height of the gas tank. He pointed to the underside of the tank. "Toggle switch. Hidden. Dutch wired a secondary ignition circuit with a parasitic draw. If the toggle's off, the battery drains in 6 hours. That's why you keep losing batteries." Jim crouched. His fingers found the switch. He looked at it for a long moment, then back at Leo. "What else?" "The timing marks on the cam cover are wrong. Not broken. Wrong on purpose. Dutch advanced everything 12 degrees off factory. There's a hand-filed notch inside the primary cover. That's the real reference point. Without it, the engine will crank, but never fire correctly." Jim stood up slowly. He turned to Rusty. "You've been looking at this bike for 19 days. An 8-year-old kid had the answer the whole time." Rusty's face went gray. "Jim, I didn't... There's no way I could have... I'm not interested in what you couldn't do. I'm interested in what happens next." Jim turned back to Leo. "Can you fix it?" "I can tell you what needs to happen. I can't do the physical work. I'm not strong enough to pull the primary cover or torque the heads. But I can tell your mechanics exactly what to do, step by step, the way my dad would have done it." Jim nodded once, a single slow inclination of his head that carried more authority than most men's entire vocabularies. "Danny," he said without turning around. Danny stepped forward. "Yeah." "This kid talks. You listen. Whatever he says goes. I don't care if he tells you to weld the exhaust pipes to the ceiling fan. You do it. Copy." Jim looked at Leo one more time. The fire behind his eyes hadn't gone out, but it had changed shape, from the blunt heat of frustration to something sharper, something more focused, something that looked almost like recognition. "What's your mother's name?" Jim asked. Leo paused. For the first time since he'd stepped out of the shadows, something flickered across his face. Not fear, but caution. The instinctive wariness of a child who has learned that when powerful people ask about your family, the question is never casual. "Maria," he said. "She know you're here?" "No?" "She's going to. Please don't. Not a discussion." Jim's voice dropped half a register, which shouldn't have been possible given how low it already was. "I'm not in the business of having kids disappear on their mothers. She gets a phone call, today, from me or from Rusty. Pick one." Leo looked at Rusty. Rusty looked at the floor. "Rusty," Leo said quietly. Jim almost smiled. Almost. The scar on his jaw twitched in a way that might have been amusement or might have been muscle memory. "Smart kid." He turned toward the door, then stopped, half-turned. His profile was silhouetted against the gray light leaking through the dirty windows. The scar, the hard jaw, the leather cut hanging heavy from shoulders that had been carrying too much for too long. "Arthur was a good man," Jim said. He wasn't looking at Leo. He was looking at the FXR. "Better than most of us deserved." He walked out. The door closed behind him. His engine fired in the lot, shook the walls for 3 seconds, and faded east on Industrial Row until the sound dissolved into the ambient noise of a city that never stopped humming. Rusty let out a breath he'd been holding for what felt like 20 minutes. "Okay," he said. "Okay. Danny, pull the primary cover. Coop, get me the timing light, and somebody find this kid a damn sandwich." The work began at 11:47 a.m., on a Thursday that would last longer than any Thursday had a right to. Danny pulled the primary cover off the FXR, while Leo stood on an overturned milk crate beside the bike, watching. The boy's eyes tracked Danny's hands with the focused intensity of a surgeon observing a procedure. Not directing yet, just watching, cataloging, confirming that the man handling the machine understood the weight of what he was touching. When Danny lifted the cover free and set it on the bench, Leo leaned in. "Inside lip," he said. 10 o'clock position. Danny tilted the cover toward the light. His fingers traced the inside surface, and stopped. A small notch, barely visible, filed into the aluminum by hand. Not stamped, not machined, filed, With the patient, imprecise precision of a man working alone in a garage at 2 in the morning with a rat-tail file and a flashlight held between his teeth. "Son of a bitch," Danny whispered. "That's your timing mark," Leo said. "Everything indexes off that notch. 12 degrees advanced from factory. My dad said Dutch called it the heartbeat offset. Said a Harley should idle like a heart, not a metronome." Danny looked at Rusty. Rusty looked at the notch. For the first time in 19 days, something moved behind his eyes that wasn't exhaustion or defeat. It was a small thing, a faint light in a dark room, but it was there. "All right," Rusty said. "Let's reset the timing." They worked through the afternoon. Leo directed from his milk crate like a foreman on a construction site, his small voice cutting through the shop noise with instructions that were disturbingly specific. Rotate the engine to top dead center using the hand-filed notch, not the factory stamp. Set the ignition advance to 12 degrees using the secondary mark. Check the cam chain tension. Dutch ran his chains loose because the non-standard cam profile needed room to breathe. Verify the pushrod geometry because Dutch mixed shovelhead and evolution components in ways that required specific clearances that no manual had ever documented. Danny followed every instruction without argument. Coop handed tools when asked. Rusty stood back and watched, oscillating between relief and something darker. The slow, corrosive realization that everything this boy knew, everything Arthur Hayes had taught his son, was information that should have been taught to Rusty. Should have been shared with the shop. Should have been documented somewhere so that when Arthur died and Dutch died and the knowledge died with them, an 8-year-old child wouldn't be the last living repository of a dead man's engineering genius. But Arthur had never shared it, because Arthur had been cut to part-time, because Rusty had cut him, not out of malice, not out of disrespect, but out of financial desperation. The slow bleed of a business that couldn't afford to keep its best mechanic and chose survival over loyalty. And Arthur had taken a second job, and ridden home in the rain, and died. Rusty stepped outside around 4 in the afternoon and stood in the gravel lot with his hands in his pockets, staring at the highway overpass in the distance. The heat was still brutal. The sky was white with haze. His shadow was short and dark at his feet. Danny came out 10 minutes later and stood beside him. "You okay?" Danny asked. "I cut his hours, Danny." "I know. He took that second job because of me, because I couldn't keep him full-time. He was riding home from a shift he shouldn't have been working, on a highway he shouldn't have been on, in weather he should have waited out. But he couldn't wait it out because the second job had a clock, and the clock didn't care about rain. Rusty, that kid is in there right now doing his father's job, his dead father's job, because I couldn't keep his father alive." Danny didn't argue. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't say the things people say when someone is drowning in guilt, because Danny understood, with the instinct of a man who'd watched enough people carry enough weight, that some truths don't need to be softened. They need to be held, just held, until the person holding them decides what to do with the weight. They stood in the lot for another 5 minutes without speaking. Then they went back inside and kept working. By 7 p.m., the timing was reset. The primary cover was reinstalled. The parasitic draw from the hidden toggle switch had been neutralized by switching it to the correct position. Danny reconnected the battery and checked the voltage. Solid, holding, no phantom drain for the first time in 19 days. But the FXR still wouldn't start. Danny hit the ignition. The engine cranked. A healthy, strong crank that sounded completely different from the weak, struggling turnover they'd been hearing for 3 weeks. The starter spun. The pistons moved. Compression built. Everything sounded right, but it didn't fire. Danny tried again, and a fourth time. Each attempt was the same. Strong crank, good compression, no ignition. The engine was turning over perfectly, but refusing to light. Leo stepped down from his milk crate. He walked around the bike slowly, his hand trailing along the frame, his eyes narrowed. He stopped at the rear cylinder and pressed his ear against the engine case. "Crank it again," he said. Danny hit the starter. The engine turned. Leo listened with his eyes closed, his small body pressed against the hot metal, his face concentrated in a way that made him look decades older than 8. "Stop," he said. Danny released the switch. Leo straightened up. His face had changed. The confident calm that had carried him through the afternoon was still there, but something new had crept in underneath it. A shadow, a hesitation, the first crack in the armor of a boy who had, until this moment, known exactly what to do. "There's something wrong with the rear cylinder," he said. "It's not getting fuel, or it's getting fuel and not firing. I need to see the push rods." "We already checked the push rods," Coop said from the corner. "They were in spec." "In spec for what?" Leo asked. "Factory spec or Dutch's spec?" Coop opened his mouth, closed it. "Pull them," Leo said. Danny looked at Rusty. Rusty nodded. They pulled the rear cylinder rocker cover and extracted the push rods, two thin steel rods, each about 10 inches long, that translated the camshaft's rotational motion into the vertical movement that opened and closed the valves. Leo held them up to the light, one in each hand, rotating them slowly. "This one's bent," he said, holding up the exhaust push rod. "Not much, maybe 2/1000ths, but on Dutch's build, 2/1000ths is the difference between running and not running." Danny took the rod and rolled it across the surface plate on the workbench. It wobbled, barely perceptible. A deviation so small that a standard inspection would have passed it without a second thought. But Dutch Sullivan didn't build standard engines. Dutch Sullivan built engines with tolerances so tight that the space between success and failure was measured in fractions of fractions. The mechanical equivalent of threading a needle while riding a motorcycle at 70 miles an hour in the dark. "We need a replacement," Danny said. "This one's done." "Do we have one?" Rusty asked. Danny checked the parts bin. Coop checked the storage room. They came back with the same answer. No. Standard push rods, yes. A dozen of them, various lengths, but none that matched the non-standard specification Dutch had used. A custom length, a custom diameter, made from a chromoly alloy that wasn't available through any normal parts catalog. "We can order one," Coop offered. "But it's custom fabrication," Danny finished. 3 to 5 business days. The words fell into the room like stones into a well. 3 to 5 business days. The memorial ride was Saturday morning. It was Thursday evening. They had roughly 36 hours. Rusty sank into the folding chair. The same folding chair he'd been sinking into for 19 days. The metal groaned under him like it was tired too. "That's it then," he said. "We're done." Leo didn't sit down. He didn't speak. He stood beside the FXR with the bent push rod still in his hand, staring at it with an expression that Rusty couldn't read. Concentration, maybe? Or memory? Or something further back than memory. Something stored in a place that only opened when everything else had closed. "My dad kept spares," Leo said. Danny looked at him. "What?" "Spare parts. For Dutch's builds. He kept them here, in the basement." "There's no basement," Rusty said. "There is," Leo said. "Under the storage room. There's a hatch in the floor under the third shelf from the wall. My dad put a piece of plywood over it and stacked parts bins on top. He said if anything ever happened to Dutch, someone would need those parts. He said he didn't trust anyone enough to tell them where they were." Leo paused. He looked at the bent push rod in his hand, then at Rusty. "He trusted me." The word trust landed in the room with the weight of a confession and the sharpness of an indictment. Arthur Hayes, quiet, invisible, underpaid. Arthur Hayes had trusted his 8-year-old son with the location of parts that could save Dutch Sullivan's legacy. He hadn't trusted the shop owner who cut his hours. He hadn't trusted the club that let him ride home alone in the rain. He hadn't trusted anyone in the entire adult world that had been built around him. He had trusted a child, because the child was the only one who hadn't failed him yet. Danny was already moving. He and Coop walked to the storage room and found the third shelf from the wall. They pulled parts bins off the top, heavy, dusty, undisturbed for years. Beneath the bins sat a sheet of plywood, warped with age, its edges flush with the shelf frame. Danny lifted the plywood. Underneath was a metal hatch set into the concrete floor. A simple ring pull, corroded but functional. Danny grabbed it and pulled. The hatch swung open with a groan of rusted hinges, releasing a breath of air that smelled like dust, old grease, and time. A wooden staircase descended into darkness. Coop grabbed the flashlight. They went down. The basement was small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, Poured concrete walls, low ceiling, no ventilation. The air was stale and thick. Cobwebs hung from the corners like curtains in an abandoned theater. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling on a frayed cord, but didn't light when Danny pulled the chain. But against the far wall, arranged with the meticulous care of a man who understood that disorder was the enemy of precision, sat a collection of parts that made Danny's breath stop in his chest. Metal shelving, rusted but organized. Each shelf labeled in handwriting, Arthur Hayes' handwriting, small and precise, written on strips of masking tape that had yellowed with age but remained legible. Pushrod sets, various specifications. Cam chains pre-measured and tagged. Gasket kits wrapped in wax paper. Valve springs sorted by tension rating. Primary chain components. Ignition modules. Carburetor jets organized in film canisters, each one labeled with an engine number and a date. This wasn't a parts stash. This was an archive. A mechanical library assembled over years by a man who had known, with the quiet foresight of someone who understood mortality better than most, that one day these parts would be needed, and the person who needed them would have no other way to find them. Arthur Hayes had built this collection in secret, in a basement nobody knew existed, beneath a shop that had cut his hours and a world that had ignored his existence. He had done it because he loved the machines, because he loved the man who built them, because he understood that legacy isn't preserved by the powerful, it's preserved by the invisible, the quiet, the ones who show up before dawn and leave after dark and never ask for credit. Danny came up the stairs carrying a small metal box. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were two chromally push rods, custom length, custom diameter, exact matches for Dutch Sullivan's FXR specification. A masking tape label on the cloth read, in Arthur's handwriting, Dutch FXR rear cylinder, just in case. Just in case. 3 words, written by a dead man years ago. Meant for a moment exactly like this one. A moment when the machines would break and the mechanics would fail, and the only thing standing between remembrance and oblivion would be a small metal box hidden in a forgotten basement by a man who had never been paid enough, never been recognized enough, never been seen clearly enough by anyone except his own son. Rusty took the box from Danny's hands. He held it for a long time, looking at the handwriting on the label. His chin trembled once. He pressed his lips together hard enough to turn them white. "All right," he said, and his voice sounded like it was being dragged across gravel. "Let's get back to work." They installed the new push rod at 9:14 p.m. Danny torqued the rocker cover to Leo's specifications. Not factory spec, not manual spec, but Dutch spec. The numbers rattled off from memory by a boy who had heard them repeated so many times they had become part of his operating system, as permanent and instinctive as breathing. By 11 p.m., the rebuild was complete. The FXR sat in the center bay under the buzzing fluorescent lights, fully reassembled, battery charged, fluids topped, every component installed according to the hidden engineering language of Dutch Sullivan, as translated through the memory of Arthur Hayes as delivered by the small, steady voice of an 8-year-old boy standing on a milk crate in a failing garage on the wrong side of Ashland, California. Nobody touched the ignition. Nobody wanted to be the one to try and fail. Not now, not after the basement, not after the push rods, not after everything this day had cost. Leo climbed down from the milk crate. His legs were shaking slightly. Not from cold, not from fear, but from the simple physical exhaustion of a child who had been standing for 12 hours on a surface designed for a gallon of milk, directing men twice his age and 3 times his size, carrying the accumulated mechanical knowledge of a dead father like Atlas carrying the sky. "It should run now," Leo said quietly. "But we shouldn't start it tonight." "Why not?" Danny asked. "Because if it doesn't work, we need time to figure out why. And if it does work, Jim should be here to hear it." Danny looked at Rusty. Rusty looked at the FXR. The bike sat in the amber light like a question that had been asked 41 days ago and still didn't have an answer. "The kid's right," Rusty said. "We wait." He picked up his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to Maria Hayes. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. Rusty didn't tell her everything. He couldn't, not on the phone, not at 11 at night, not to a woman who was already carrying more than any person should carry alone. He told her Leo was safe, that the boy had been coming to the shop after school, that he'd been helping with a project and lost track of time. Maria's voice on the other end was tight with fear and anger and the bottomless fatigue of a single mother working hospital laundry shifts who had just discovered her only child had been lying to her for 3 weeks. Rusty told her he'd drive Leo home. Maria said she'd be waiting at the door. The second call was to Jim. "Tomorrow morning," Rusty said. 7 a.m. The bike's rebuilt. We're going to try the ignition. Jim was quiet for 4 seconds. Then, "The kid did it?" "The kid did it." "Is it going to start?" "I don't know, Jim. Nobody knows, but it's the best shot we've had in 19 days, and it's the only shot we've got left." Another silence. 2 seconds this time. 7 a.m., Jim said. "And I'm not coming alone." The line went dead. Rusty pocketed the phone and looked at Danny. Danny was staring at the FXR with an expression that lived somewhere between hope and terror. The face of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether the rope he's holding is strong enough to catch him. "He said he's not coming alone," Rusty said. "How many?" "He didn't say." "That's worse." "Yeah." Rusty drove Leo home at midnight in a pickup truck that smelled like oil and old coffee. The boy sat in the passenger seat with his seatbelt on, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes watching the streetlights pass with the distant focus of someone who was already somewhere else in his mind. They didn't talk for the first 5 minutes. The truck's engine rattled through quiet residential streets, where porch lights were off, and sprinklers hissed in dark yards. "Your dad was the best mechanic I ever worked with," Rusty said finally. Leo didn't look at him. "I know. I should have kept him on full time. I should have found the money. I should have—" He stopped, swallowed. "I should have done a lot of things." "Yeah," Leo said. "You should have." No forgiveness, no absolution, no gentle redirection from a child trying to make a guilty man feel better. Just the clean, precise truth spoken by a boy who had spent 14 months understanding exactly what his father's death had cost and who had contributed to the cost. Rusty gripped the steering wheel and drove. Maria Hayes was standing behind the screen door of a small rented house on Coulter Street when the truck pulled into the driveway. The porch light was the only light on the block. She was thin, dark-haired, wearing hospital scrubs and an expression that combined fury and relief in equal, devastating measure. Leo got out of the truck without saying goodbye to Rusty. He walked up the porch steps. Maria opened the screen door, pulled him inside, and held him with both arms in a grip so tight it looked like she was trying to physically prevent him from disappearing again. She looked at Rusty over Leo's head. One look, no words necessary. Rusty backed out of the driveway and drove to the shop and sat in the dark parking lot for 45 minutes with the engine off, staring at the dead neon sign, thinking about Arthur Hayes and Dutch Sullivan and a little boy carrying a world that should never have been placed on his shoulders, and the 20 bikes that would arrive in 7 hours to hear a motorcycle start or watch a legacy die. Inside Apex Ironworks, the FXR waited in the center bay. Silent. Complete. Rebuilt by the ghost of a man who had been dead for 14 months, through the hands of mechanics who had failed for 19 days, guided by the voice of a child who had never once been asked if he was okay. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The coffee in the pot was cold. The clock on the wall read 1:17 a.m. Friday had begun, and somewhere across Ashland, 20 Iron Reapers were checking their fuel, tightening their boots, and riding toward a moment that none of them, not the hardest, not the oldest, not the most feared among them, were prepared for. Because when Jim Mercer said he wasn't coming alone, he meant everyone. And everyone meant the full weight of the Iron Reaper's MC, every patch, every officer, every man who had ever sworn an oath to Dutch Sullivan, descending on a failing garage on Industrial Row to hear a dead man's motorcycle either breathe or die. There would be no third chance. Friday arrived like a held breath that refused to release. At 5:47 a.m., the sky above Ashland was the color of wet concrete, low, heavy, starless, pressing down on the industrial district like a hand trying to smother something. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees overnight. A cold front from the Pacific had pushed inland while the city slept, replacing the brutal heat with something worse, a damp, bone-deep chill that settled into metal and concrete and human joints with the patient cruelty of something that intended to stay. Rusty hadn't slept. He'd tried. He'd driven home from the shop at 2 a.m., sat on the edge of his bed with his boots still on, stared at the wall for 40 minutes, then driven back. He was standing in the center bay at 5:50, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hands, staring at Dutch Sullivan's FXR the way a surgeon stares at a patient before an operation he's not sure will survive. The bike looked different in the early morning light. The flat black paint seemed to absorb the gray coming through the dirty windows. The chrome, what was left of it, reflected nothing. The machine sat on its kickstand with a stillness that felt deliberate, almost sentient, as if it knew what was coming and had not yet decided whether to cooperate. Danny arrived at 6. He didn't say good morning. He walked to the workbench, picked up a rag, wiped his hands even though they were already clean, and stood beside Rusty in the kind of silence that exists between men who have nothing left to say and too much left to feel. Coop came in at 6:15 carrying a bag of gas station donuts that nobody would eat. At 6:22, a car pulled into the gravel lot. Not a motorcycle. A car. A dented gray Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and a passenger door that didn't match the body color. Leo got out of the passenger side. Maria Hayes got out of the driver's side. She was small, 5'3", maybe less, with dark hair pulled back tight, and the kind of face that had been pretty once before exhaustion and grief had sanded it down to something harder, sharper, more functional. She wore a navy blue jacket over hospital scrubs and sneakers that were too white for the gravel lot, and she walked toward the garage door with her hand on Leo's shoulder in a grip that was equal parts protection and restraint. Rusty met them at the door. "Maria, I didn't expect—" "Where is it?" she said. "Where's what?" "The motorcycle. The one my son's been sneaking out of the house for 3 weeks to work on. The one that belongs to the men who let my husband ride home alone in a rainstorm. Where is it?" Her voice wasn't loud. It was controlled, contained. The voice of a woman who had learned, through 14 months of single parenthood and hospital laundry shifts, and landlords who didn't care, and bills that didn't stop, that losing control was a luxury she could no longer afford. But underneath the control, underneath the pressed flat calm, there was something vibrating, a wire pulled so tight it hummed. "It's inside," Rusty said. "Maria, I want to explain. I don't need your explanation. I need to see what my son has been doing in this building unsupervised for 19 days while I thought he was at the after-school program." She looked down at Leo. "Show me." Leo walked inside. Maria followed. Rusty stepped aside because stepping aside was the only intelligent option when Maria Hayes was moving in a straight line. She stopped when she saw the FXR. Her face did something complicated, a sequence of micro-expressions that moved across her features like weather across a landscape. Recognition, pain, anger, and beneath all of it, something older and deeper. Something that looked like the memory of a version of herself that had existed before the phone call at midnight 14 months ago that had divided her life into before and after. She knew this motorcycle. She had seen it in Dutch Sullivan's yard 100 times. She had listened to Arthur talk about it at the dinner table, the cam profiles, the custom tolerances, the hand-filed timing marks, the engineering language that Dutch spoke and Arthur translated and nobody else on earth understood. She had watched her husband come home at 10, 11, midnight, smelling like gasoline and metal shavings, his hands so stained with grease that no amount of soap could get them clean. And she had loved him anyway, loved him because of it, loved the quiet dedication of a man who treated machines like living things and treated his family like the only reason he came home at all. She turned to Rusty. "He was 8 years old," she said. 8 years old riding a city bus across Ashland to a condemned building in the industrial district. For 3 weeks. And nobody noticed. Not the bus driver. Not the school. Not you. Nobody. "I didn't know he was here until yesterday." "That's worse, Rusty. That's not better. That's worse." "I know." "Do you? Because my son was hiding in your ceiling for 19 days and you didn't hear him, didn't see him, didn't smell his lunch bag, Didn't notice a single thing that would have told you a child was living inside your walls like a... She stopped herself. Breathed. He's all I have. He is the only thing I have left of Arthur. And you people, this shop, this club, these men, you're pulling him into the same world that killed his father. The words landed in the garage like shrapnel. Rusty absorbed them with his whole body, shoulders hunching, chin dropping, the physical posture of a man accepting a blow he knows he deserves. Leo stood beside the motorcycle, watching his mother with an expression that was heartbreaking in its complexity. Love, guilt, defiance, and the terrible maturity of a child who understands that protecting one parent sometimes means deceiving them. "Mom," he said quietly. "Don't," Maria said. "Not right now." "Mom, they need me." "They needed your father, too. Look what that got him." The sentence cracked the room open. Danny turned away. Coop found something urgent to do with a socket wrench. Rusty stood perfectly still, taking the hit, because the hit was earned and he knew it, and everyone in the room knew it. Then the sound came. Not one engine, not 12. More. A rolling, building, overlapping thunder that started at the far end of Industrial Row and grew louder with each passing second, the cumulative exhaust of 24 Harley-Davidsons approaching in formation. The sound so massive, it vibrated the tools on the pegboard and rattled the coffee in Rusty's abandoned cup. Maria's head turned toward the door. Her hand found Leo's shoulder again. "How many?" she asked. Her voice had changed. The anger was still there, but something else had joined it, the primal alertness of a mother sensing a predator. "I don't know," Rusty said. "Jim said he wasn't coming alone." "Who's Jim?" "He's the one who—" Rusty stopped, reconsidered. "He's the reason the bike matters." The engines grew louder. The building shook. Dust drifted from the ceiling beams. The neon sign outside buzzed with a frequency that matched the approaching rumble. Then silence. All at once. 20-something engines cutting simultaneously, the sudden absence of sound so violent it felt like pressure change in a submarine. Boot heels on gravel. Many of them. A percussion section of leather and steel, moving toward the door in staggered rhythm. The roll-up door rattled. Someone hit it from outside. 3 heavy blows that weren't knocks. They were announcements. Danny walked to the door and pulled the chain. The door rose with a metallic screech. Morning light flooded the garage. Gray, cold, overcast. And standing in the gravel lot, arranged in a loose semicircle behind their motorcycles, were 22 Iron Reapers. 22 men in black leather cuts, each bearing the winged skull insignia. 22 faces carved by wind, sun, road, time, and the particular kind of aging that comes from living outside the lines that normal society draws around itself. Some were young, mid-20s, hard-jawed, still carrying the wiry tension of men who hadn't yet learned which fights to walk away from. Some were old, grayed, weathered, slow-moving, their patches so faded the skull was barely visible. One was in a wheelchair, a massive, barrel-chested man with no legs below the knee, his chair parked between 2 bikes, his arms thick enough to suggest the legs had been replaced by upper body strength that could bend pipe. Jim stood at the center. He had a new cigarette between his fingers, unlit. He was looking past Rusty, past Danny, past the shop, looking directly at Maria Hayes, who was standing inside the garage with her hand on her son's shoulder and an expression on her face that would have made most men step back. Jim didn't step back. He walked forward. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. "Don't," Maria said. "Whatever speech you have prepared, I don't want to hear it." Jim stopped, 6 feet away, the same distance he'd maintained with Leo yesterday. The distance of a man who understands boundaries even when the world assumes he doesn't have any. "No speech," he said. "I came to ask your permission." "My permission." "For your boy to be here today. For what happens next." "What happens next is my son goes home with me and you find another way to fix your motorcycle." "The motorcycle is fixed. Your son fixed it. He's 8. I know what he is. I also know what his father was. And I know what Dutch was. And I know that the 3 of them, Dutch, Arthur, and your boy, are connected by something I can't duplicate and can't replace and can't buy in a parts catalog. Maria stared at him. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were wet, but the tears weren't falling because Maria Hayes had spent 14 months training her tears to stay where she put them. "You let my husband die," she said. The words moved through the room like a blade. 22 men in the parking lot went silent, the ones who could hear, which was most of them, because sound carried in this kind of cold air, and Maria's voice carried farther than most. Jim didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't defend. He stood there and received the sentence the way a man receives a verdict he's been expecting for a long time. "Yes," he said. One word. No qualification. No context. No, but we didn't know. No, it wasn't our fault. No, the weather was bad. Just yes. An admission delivered with the blunt honesty of a man who understood that the difference between accountability and excuse-making was the difference between respect and cowardice. Maria's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. She had been ready for deflection, for rationalization, for the smooth machinery of denial that every institution, local, legal, corporate, outlaw, uses to avoid responsibility. She had been ready to fight. She had not been ready for surrender. "Arthur called the clubhouse," she said, and her voice was shaking now, not with anger, but with something rawer, something that had been locked inside her for 14 months and was now clawing its way out. "The night he died. He called at 9:30. I know because I was standing in the kitchen and I heard him on the phone. He said his rear tire was bad. He said it was raining and the roads were slick and he didn't feel safe riding home. He asked if someone could come get him or if he could wait at the shop until the rain stopped." She paused. The garage was so quiet the fluorescent buzz sounded like screaming. "Someone answered that phone," Maria said. "Someone at your clubhouse picked up the phone and listened to my husband ask for help. And then my husband got on his motorcycle with a bad tire in a rainstorm and rode home alone and died on Route 112 at 11 o'clock at night." She looked at Jim with eyes that held no mercy and no illusion. "Who answered the phone, Jim?" The question detonated in the room. Not with sound, but with gravity. A sudden, crushing increase in the weight of everything, as if the building itself had absorbed the question and was now pressing down on every man present with the full force of a truth that had been buried for 14 months. Jim's face changed. Not much. A fraction. The scar along his jaw seemed to tighten. His pale gray eyes, which had been flat and unreadable since he walked in, developed something underneath. Not surprise, but recognition. The look of a man who has just been shown a wound he knew existed, but had never been forced to examine in daylight. He turned his head slightly, toward the parking lot, toward the 22 men standing in formation behind their bikes. "Garrett," Jim said. One name, spoken quietly, without accusation, without drama. Just a name placed into the air like a key turned in a lock, movement in the lot, a shifting. The semicircle of bikers adjusted almost imperceptibly, the way a school of fish adjusts when one fish moves wrong. Eyes turned, not all at once but in sequence, domino style, toward a man standing near the back of the formation. Garrett Voss. He was mid-40s, lean, angular, with a narrow face and deep-set eyes that always seemed to be calculating distances. The distance between himself and the door, himself and the nearest exit, himself and the edge of whatever lie he was currently constructing. He'd been with the Iron Reapers for 11 years. He ran the club's communication, phones, messages, contacts. He was the voice on the other end of the line, always had been. He was the man who had answered the phone the night Arthur Hayes called. Garrett didn't move. His face didn't change. But his hands, hanging at his sides, partially hidden by the length of his cut, curled into fists so tight the tendons stood out against the backs of his wrists like cables. "I don't remember that call," Garrett said. Jim turned fully now, slowly, the way a gun turret rotates, mechanical, deliberate, unhurried. He faced Garrett across 20 feet of gravel and cold morning air. "You don't remember?" "We get a lot of calls. I can't remember every—" "A man who worked for Dutch Sullivan for 19 years called our house and said he needed help, and you don't remember." "Jim, that was over a year ago. I take 50 calls a week. I can't. Did you pass the message? Silence. Garrett, did you pass the message to anyone in the club? The silence stretched. 3 seconds. 5. 7. Each second felt like a minute. Each minute felt like a verdict being written in real time by every man present, their faces hardening, their bodies going still with the coiled tension of men who understand that betrayal isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just a phone call that goes unanswered, and a man who dies alone on a highway because someone couldn't be bothered to write down a message. He wasn't a member, Garrett said finally. The words fell into the lot like a match into gasoline. He was a civilian contractor, Garrett continued, and there was something desperate in his voice now, the frantic quality of a man who can feel the ground shifting beneath him and is trying to find footing that no longer exists. He didn't have a patch. He didn't ride with us. He was a mechanic, a good mechanic, sure. Dutch liked him, but he wasn't family, and there were other things happening that night. Club business, priority communications. I made a judgment call. A judgment call, Jim repeated. The words came out flat. Dead, stripped of every emotion except the one that lives at the absolute bottom of human feeling, the cold, clear recognition that something unforgivable has been confirmed. He wasn't a member, Jim. He worked for Dutch for 19 years. Working for Dutch and being one of us are two different things. You know that. Jim took one step forward, just one, but the step contained so much compressed force that Garrett visibly flinched. A small, involuntary backward lean that betrayed every ounce of the fear he was trying to hide beneath protocol and policy, and the technicality of a patch that Arthur Hayes had never worn. Dutch is dead, Jim said. Arthur is dead. Arthur's wife is standing inside that garage right now, looking at me, and I just told her yes. I told her we let her husband die. And the reason we let her husband die is because you decided that a man who gave us 19 years of his life wasn't worth a 2-minute phone call. Garrett's mouth opened. Nothing came out. You could have called anyone, Jim continued. You could have called me. You could have called Dutch. You could have called any one of the 47 men in this club and said, Arthur needs a ride. His tire's bad. It's raining. 2 sentences, 30 seconds. And Arthur Hayes drives home in someone's truck and tucks his kid into bed and wakes up the next morning and goes back to work, and his wife still has a husband and his son still has a father. Jim was close now. Close enough that Garrett could see the individual scar tissue fibers along his jaw. Close enough to smell the leather and engine oil and cold morning air that clung to Jim's cut like a second skin. Instead, Jim said, you made a judgment call, and a good man is dead, and his 8-year-old son just spent 19 days sitting on a condemned catwalk in a stranger's garage because nobody else alive knows how to fix the motorcycle his father spent his life maintaining. That's your judgment, Garrett. That's what your call did. Garrett's face had gone the color of old newspaper. His eyes were darting, left, right, searching for an ally, a defender, anyone in the formation who might step in and say something, anything, to defuse what was happening. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because every man in that lot was doing the same math. Every man was tracing the line backward from this moment to a rainy night 14 months ago. And the line passed through Garrett Voss like a highway passes through a town that no one stops in. And every man understood, with the quiet, devastating clarity of hindsight, that Arthur Hayes' death had not been an accident of weather or bad tires or unlucky timing. It had been an accident of indifference, the most human, the most common, the most unforgivable kind. Inside the garage, Maria Hayes was crying, not loudly, not dramatically. She was standing beside Dutch Sullivan's motorcycle with her hand still on Leo's shoulder, and tears were running down her face in straight, silent lines, and she was making no effort to stop them because she had just heard, for the first time, the full shape of the thing that had killed her husband. Not the blown tire, not the rain, not the guardrail. A phone call. A judgment call. A man deciding that Arthur Hayes wasn't important enough to save. Leo wasn't crying. He was looking at Garrett Voss through the open garage door with an expression that no 8-year-old should be capable of. Not anger, not hatred, but a recognition so complete and so adult that it aged his face by a decade in the space of 3 seconds. He was looking at the man who had let his father die, and he was filing that face into the same compartment where he stored cam profiles and timing specifications and pushrod dimensions. Permanent memory, precision cataloged, never to be forgotten. Jim turned away from Garrett. He walked back toward the garage. His boots on gravel sounded like a judge's gavel, slow, measured, final. He stopped in the doorway, looked at Maria. "I didn't know," he said. "About the call. I didn't know until right now. That's not an excuse. That's a fact, and I'm going to deal with it." Maria wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Deal with it how? That's club business." "My husband's death is not club business. My husband's death is my business." Jim considered this. His jaw worked. The scar stretched and contracted. "You're right," he said. "And I owe you more than I can pay. But right now there's a motorcycle in this garage that your son put back together, and there are 47 men waiting to ride it to the coast tomorrow to say goodbye to the man who built it. And your boy is the reason that ride can happen. I'm asking you to let him see this through." Maria looked at Leo. Leo looked back at her, and something passed between them. Not a conversation, not even an understanding, but a transfer. A moment where the mother saw, fully and without illusion, that the boy standing beside her was no longer entirely a child. That the knowledge Arthur had given him, the skills, the mechanical inheritance, the bedtime stories made of steel and timing marks, those things had made Leo into something more than an 8-year-old with dirty sneakers and a borrowed t-shirt. They had made him into a bridge between the living and the dead, and bridges don't get to choose who walks across them. "1 hour," Maria said. "I'll be in the car." She walked out. She didn't look at Garrett Voss. She didn't look at the 22 bikers in the lot. She walked to her dented gray Honda and got in and closed the door and sat there with her hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, containing everything inside herself, the way she had learned to contain everything since the night her phone rang at midnight and a voice on the other end told her that the man she loved was never coming home. Inside the garage, the air had changed. The revelation about Garrett had altered the molecular composition of the room, the way a crack in a dam changes the pressure of the entire reservoir. What had been a simple task, start the bike, honor the dead, ride to the coast, was now something heavier, something stained with guilt and complicity, and the terrible understanding that the club's failure wasn't abstract. It had a name. It had a face. It had a specific moment on a specific night when a specific man had made a specific choice, and that choice had left a woman without a husband and a boy without a father and a motorcycle without the only mechanic who could keep it alive. Jim walked to the FXR. He stood beside it. He didn't touch it. He just stood there, looking at the machine, and for the first time since he'd entered the story, since the first convoy, the first threat, the first silence, something behind his eyes was visible. Not grief, not anger, something worse. Something that looked like the realization that the promise he'd made to Dutch, on the porch of that trailer 11 months ago, "Don't let her rot," was about more than a motorcycle. It was about Arthur, about Maria, about Leo, about every invisible person who had kept the club's world running while the club looked the other way. "Danny," Jim said. "Yeah." "Get Garrett out of the lot. Send him home. I don't want him here when we start this bike." "And after?" "After is after." Danny walked outside. The murmur of voices in the lot was brief, terse, ugly. A single Harley engine fired, Garrett's, and pulled out of the lot with the aggressive throttle of a man who knew he was leaving but didn't know if he'd ever be allowed back. The remaining 21 Reapers filed into the garage. They moved in 2s and 3s, filling the workspace along the walls, leaning against tool benches and parts racks and concrete pillars, their leather creaking in the cold air, their faces set in the particular expression of men who have just witnessed an internal reckoning and are still processing the fallout. The garage was full now, packed. The air was thick with body heat, leather, exhaust fumes still clinging to cuts, and the sharp undercurrent of adrenaline that comes from proximity to truth. Leo stood beside the FXR. He was the smallest person in the room by a factor that was almost absurd. A thin, serious-faced boy in an oversized t-shirt, surrounded by 21 of the most dangerous men in Central California, standing beside a motorcycle that represented everything those men had ever believed in and everything they had ever failed to protect. Jim looked at Leo. "Is it ready?" "It should be? Should be or is?" Leo looked at the motorcycle, then at Jim. "There's only one way to find out." Jim nodded. He swung his leg over the FXR and settled onto the cracked leather seat. His weight compressed the suspension. His hands found the grips, worn rubber, shaped by Dutch Sullivan's palms over thousands of miles. His boots found the pegs. His right thumb found the starter button. 21 men held their breath. Leo held his. Jim hit the starter. The engine cranked. Strong, healthy, the rebuilt compression building with each revolution. The starter motor whined. The pistons moved. The camshaft turned according to timing marks that existed in no manual, filed by hand by a dead man, decoded by a dead man's son, set by mechanics who had spent 19 days failing before a child showed them what they couldn't see. The engine cranked and cranked and cranked, and nothing happened. No ignition, no fire, no life. The engine turned over with perfect mechanical precision and absolute electrical silence. Everything moved. Nothing lit. Jim released the starter. The engine spun down. Silence filled the room like water filling a sinking ship. Leo's face went white. Not embarrassment, not disappointment. Something deeper. The specific, devastating terror of a child who has staked everything on a belief and watched it fail in front of every person who mattered. His hands, hanging at his sides, began to tremble. His lower lip compressed against his teeth. His eyes, those impossibly steady brown eyes that had carried him through 19 days of hiding and 12 hours of directing grown men and one morning of watching his mother cry. Those eyes were losing their steadiness. He was 8 years old, and for the first time since he'd stepped out of the shadows, he looked it. "Try again," Danny said from the corner. Jim hit the starter. Same result. Strong crank. No ignition. "Again," Coop said. A third attempt? Nothing. The room was dying. You could feel it happening. The slow collapse of hope, the gravitational pull of failure, the weight of a dead man's motorcycle refusing to live despite everything, despite the hidden switch, despite the hand-filed timing marks, despite the basement full of spare parts, despite the impossible knowledge of an 8-year-old boy who had given everything he had, and watched it amount to nothing. Leo stepped forward. His voice, when it came, was small. Smaller than it had been at any point in the past 24 hours. The voice of a child. Just a child. "Wait," he said. He pressed his hands against the engine case, closed his eyes, listened to something nobody else could hear. A memory, maybe, or a frequency, or the echo of his father's voice explaining something at bedtime that hadn't seemed important then, but was the only important thing now. His eyes opened. "The switch," he said. Jim looked at him. "I turned it on yesterday. Danny confirmed it." "Not that switch," Leo said. And his voice was changing again, steadying, the child retreating behind the mechanic the way a person retreats behind a wall when the shelling starts. "There's another one." Silence. "Dutch built 2 bypasses," Leo said. "My dad told me about the first one. The toggle under the gas tank. That's the one everyone knew about. But there was a second one, a fail-safe. Dutch called it the dead man's switch. He said if he ever died, he didn't want just anyone starting his bike. He wanted someone who knew the poem." Leo reached beneath the gas tank with his right hand. His small fingers traced along the frame rail, past the toggle switch they'd found yesterday, past the wiring harness, past the fuel line, deeper, further back, into a recess between the backbone tube and the oil tank that no adult hand could have reached without disassembling the frame. His fingers found something. A second switch. Smaller. Hidden in a space so tight that only a child's hand, or the hand of a man who had built the bike and knew exactly where to reach, could access it. Leo flipped it and looked up at Jim with the wet, exhausted, terrified eyes of an 8-year-old boy who had just played his last card in a game he hadn't asked to join. "Now try," he whispered. Jim's thumb found the starter button. Every man in the garage locked his jaw. Maria Hayes, sitting in her car in the parking lot, gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. watching through the windshield, not breathing. Jim pressed the button. The engine caught, not gradually, not with hesitation, not with the tentative cough of a machine waking from a long sleep. It caught the way a fist catches a jaw. Sudden, total, violent. One moment there was silence, and the next moment there was thunder, a deep, chest-crushing roar that erupted from the twin pipes with enough force to rattle every tool on every pegboard in the garage, to vibrate the fluorescent tubes in their housings until two of them flickered and died, to shake loose a rain of dust and rust flakes from the ceiling beams that fell through the air like brown snow. Fire. Actual fire. A 6-inch tongue of blue-orange flame that shot from the rear exhaust pipe and licked the concrete floor before vanishing. Then another from the front pipe. The combustion was raw, unfiltered, a controlled explosion happening 60 times per second inside cylinders that hadn't fired in over a year. And the sound was not mechanical. It was organic. It was alive. It was the voice of something that had been trapped inside cold steel for 41 days and was now screaming its way back into existence with a fury that made the air itself feel combustible. The idol settled, low, heavy, uneven in the way that only a Harley with a radical cam and advanced timing can be uneven. The signature potato, potato, potato that wasn't a rhythm so much as a heartbeat, each compression stroke landing slightly off-center from the last, creating a pulse that was felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled through the frame and through Jim's hands and through the concrete floor and into the boots of every man standing in that garage. Jim's hands were shaking on the grips, not from the vibration. His hands were shaking the way hands shake when the body can no longer contain what's happening inside it, and the overflow has to go somewhere. His jaw was locked. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at the tachometer that wasn't there. Dutch had removed the gauges years ago because Dutch said a man who needed instruments to ride didn't deserve to ride. And inside Jim's chest, behind the scar tissue and the silence and the 30 years of compressed grief that he had never once allowed to surface, something was breaking, not breaking apart, breaking open. The roar of Dutch Sullivan's FXR filled the garage the way a voice fills a cathedral, completely, inescapably, with a resonance that seemed to come from the walls themselves rather than the machine at the center. And every man in that room heard something different in it. Some heard Dutch. Some heard Arthur. Some heard their own fathers, their own dead, their own versions of the men they'd failed to protect or failed to become. The sound was a mirror. It reflected whatever you carried, and what these men carried was enough to fill an ocean. Nobody spoke. Jim sat on the motorcycle for a full minute, the engine idling, his hands gripping the bars so hard his knuckles were bone white. His chin dropped to his chest. His shoulders, those massive, overburdened shoulders that had been carrying the weight of the club and the weight of the promise and the weight of a dead man's memory for 41 days, began to tremble. Then a sound came out of Jim Mercer that none of the 21 men present had ever heard before, and none of them would ever hear again. He exhaled. It was a long, ragged, torn-open exhale that carried something inside it. Not a sob, not a cry, but the sound of a man finally releasing a pressure that had been building for so long it had become structural, load-bearing, part of the architecture of who he was. And when it left him, when that breath escaped into the thunderous air of the garage and was swallowed by the roar of the engine, Jim Mercer's face changed. The scar was still there. The hardness was still there. But something behind his eyes had shifted, the way tectonic plates shift, invisibly, permanently, with consequences that would take time to surface. He looked at Leo. The boy was standing 3 feet from the motorcycle, his right hand still trembling at his side, the hand that had reached into the frame and found the dead man's switch in a space no adult could access. His face was streaked, not with grease, with tears. Silent, unchecked tears running down cheeks that were too thin and too young for the weight they'd been carrying. And Leo made no move to wipe them because he was 8 years old and he had just brought his father's greatest work back to life, and the grief and the pride and the exhaustion had finally found the crack in his armor and were pouring through it all at once. Jim killed the engine. The silence that followed was the loudest silence any of them had ever heard. It rang. It echoed. It occupied the space where the roar had been, with an emptiness so profound it felt physical. a void in the air, a hole in the sound, a moment of absolute zero that separated what had just happened from everything that would happen next. Jim climbed off the bike. He stood for a moment, steadying himself with one hand on the seat, and then he did something that 21 Iron Reapers would remember for the rest of their lives. He knelt. Jim Mercer, enforcer, road captain, the most feared man in the Iron Reapers' MC, a man who had not bent his knee to anything or anyone in 30 years of outlaw life, knelt on the oil-stained concrete floor of Apex Ironworks in front of an 8-year-old boy. He reached into his cut. From the inside breast pocket, the pocket closest to his chest, the pocket where men in this life keep the things that matter more than weapons or money or identification, he pulled out a medallion, silver, tarnished with age. A winged skull cast in heavy metal suspended from a steel ball chain that had been worn smooth by decades of contact with skin. The wings were spread wide. The skull's jaw was open. On the reverse, etched in small letters that were barely visible without a magnifying glass, were 2 words, family only. Jim held it in his palm for a moment, looking at it. This medallion had belonged to Dutch. Before Dutch, it had belonged to Dutch's father. Before that, to a man whose name nobody alive remembered anymore. It was the oldest artifact the Iron Reapers possessed. It was not given. It was not earned. It was inherited, passed from one generation to the next at moments of such significance that the act of passing it became part of the club's DNA. Jim placed the chain over Leo's head. The medallion settled against the boy's chest, heavy and cold against the thin fabric of his oversized t-shirt, the winged skull resting directly over his heart. "This means you're ours," Jim said. His voice was raw, scraped, the voice of a man speaking through the wreckage of an emotion he'd spent a lifetime refusing to acknowledge. "This means nobody touches you, nobody threatens you, nobody comes near your mother. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. You understand?" Leo looked down at the medallion. He wrapped his small fingers around it. The metal was cold. It wouldn't stay cold for long. "I understand," he said. Jim stood up. His knees cracked. His jaw tightened. The emotion retreated behind his eyes as quickly as it had surfaced, replaced by the operational hardness of a man who had allowed himself one moment of vulnerability and was now returning to the fortified version of himself that the world required. He turned to the room. 21 faces looked back at him. "Memorial ride, tomorrow, 6 a.m., Dutch's bike leads. I ride it. Nobody touches this machine except Danny, and nobody touches this kid. Clear?" 21 voices, low and rough and absolute. "Clear." Jim walked toward the door, then stopped, because outside in the gravel lot, something was wrong. The sound came first. Not Harley's, not the familiar rumble of V-twins and straight pipes. This was different. The high, whining growl of Japanese 4-cylinders, at least 3 of them, approaching fast from the west end of Industrial Row. Danny was at the window in 2 seconds. His face changed. "Vipers," he said. The word moved through the room like an electric current. Bodies shifted, spines straightened, hands that had been hanging loose found pockets, belt lines, tool handles. The transition from emotional vulnerability to combat readiness took less than 3 seconds. A practiced, instinctive switch that every man in the room had performed before and hoped every single time would be the last. The Crimson Vipers. A rival club that had been pressing into Iron Reaper territory for 6 months, not with violence, not yet, but with the slow, calculated encroachment of a predator testing boundaries. They ran methamphetamine through the Central Valley. They had ties to distribution networks that the Reapers had never touched and never wanted to touch. And they had been watching, waiting, circling, looking for the moment when the Iron Reapers were weakest. That moment was now. Dutch was dead. The club was grieving. The power structure was vulnerable. And Garrett Voss, Garrett, who had been sent home from the lot an hour ago, humiliated, exposed, stripped of the only protection his patch had ever given him, Garrett had apparently decided that revenge was more important than loyalty. 3 motorcycles turned onto Industrial Row. Sport bikes. Low, fast, aggressive. They pulled into the far end of the gravel lot and stopped in a line, engines idling with the high-pitched buzz that Harley men despised on principle. 3 riders dismounted. Leather vests, no sleeves, red and black patches. They walked toward the garage with the unhurried confidence of men who had been invited. The one in front was Dominic Slade. He was 40, built like a welterweight fighter who'd retired from the ring, but not from fighting, with a shaved head and a neck tattoo that read "No Mercy" in Gothic script. He ran the Viper's Ashland chapter. He was smart, he was patient, and he was smiling. The kind of smile that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with the knowledge that you're holding cards your opponent doesn't know about. Jim stepped into the lot. The 21 Reapers followed, fanning out behind him in a formation that was half instinct, half choreography. A line of leather and scar tissue and clenched jaws that stretched across the front of the garage like a wall. "Wrong address, Dom," Jim said. Slade stopped 10 feet away. His smile didn't waver. "Nah, Jim, right address. Got a call this morning, interesting call, from a Reaper who says you're falling apart at the seams." Jim didn't react. His face was stone. But behind him, a ripple of tension moved through the line, the specific kind of tension that comes from hearing a suspicion confirmed out loud. "Garrett. Your boy Garrett called me at 7 this morning," Slade continued. His voice was casual, conversational, the tone of a man discussing the weather while standing on a landmine. "Told me quite a story. Dead president, dead mechanic, broken motorcycle, kid genius. Internal beef. Sounds like the kind of situation where a man might want to rethink his loyalties." "Garrett doesn't speak for this club," Jim said. "No, he spoke for you pretty well. Told me about the memorial ride tomorrow. Told me the route. Told me how many bikes. Told me Dutch's FXR is the only thing holding your club together right now, and if something happened to that bike before Saturday morning, the Iron Reapers would be done." The words landed like mortar rounds. Jim's jaw muscles worked beneath the scar. Beside him, Danny's hands curled into fists. Behind them, 20 men shifted their weight forward, the unconscious lean of a group preparing to move as one. "What do you want, Dom?" Jim said. "I want what I've always wanted. The corridor, industrial row to the waterfront, your territory, your routes, your revenue. Dutch is gone. Your bleeding members. Your communication man just sold you out for a phone call. And inside that garage is a motorcycle that means more to your club than any of you will admit, which means it's the easiest leverage I've ever been handed. You're not getting the corridor. I'm not asking, Jim. I'm informing. The corridor changes hands by Sunday, peacefully or otherwise. And that bike, Dutch's bike, is my insurance policy. Because as long as that machine exists, your club has a symbol, a rallying point, something to ride behind. Take that away, and you're just a bunch of old men in leather vests playing pretend." Slade looked past Jim, through the garage door, at the FXR sitting in the center bay. His eyes lingered on it, the way a man's eyes linger on something he intends to destroy. "Nice bike," he said. "Be a shame." Jim moved, not fast, not slow. He moved with the deliberate mechanical precision of a man who has decided, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, that talking is over. He closed the 10-foot gap in 4 steps. His right hand came up, not a fist, an open hand, palm out, and he pressed it flat against Dominic Slade's chest with enough force to stop the man's forward momentum cold. Slade's 2 escorts reached for their waists. 21 Reapers surged forward 1 step in unison. A single, synchronized movement that produced a sound like a stampede starting and stopping in the same breath. "Don't," Jim said. He wasn't talking to Slade's men. He was talking to everyone. The word froze the lot. Jim's hand stayed on Slade's chest. He could feel the man's heartbeat through his palm, fast, but controlled. Slade wasn't scared. Slade was excited. And that made him more dangerous than a scared man would have been, because scared men make mistakes and excited men make plans. "You come to my garage," Jim said, his voice so low it was nearly subterranean. "On the week we bury our president, with information sold to you by a traitor, and you threaten the motorcycle that my brother built with his hands." His fingers curled slightly into the fabric of Slade's vest. "I'm going to say this once, Dom. One time. Listen carefully because I will not say it again." Jim leaned in, close enough that Slade could see every line in his scar, every burst capillary in his eyes, every year of violence and loss and survival mapped across his face like a topographic chart of hell. That bike rides tomorrow. That memorial happens tomorrow. And if you or your crew or anyone who has ever worn your patch comes within a mile of this shop or that ride, I will dismantle your club one member at a time, starting with you, and I will do it so thoroughly that in 5 years people will forget the Crimson Vipers ever existed. He released Slade's vest, stepped back. One step. Slade straightened his vest. His smile had changed. Thinner now, harder, the smile of a man recalculating. 47 bikes on an open highway, Slade said. That's a lot of exposure, Jim. A lot of road. A lot of things that can go wrong between here and the coast. 47 bikes and 47 men who've got nothing left to lose. You want to test that math, Dom? You want to ride against men who are already grieving? Men who are already angry? Men who just found out one of their own got a good man killed and sold their route to a tweaker crew? Slade held Jim's stare for 3 seconds. 4, 5. Then his eyes flicked, just for a moment, just a fraction, to the garage, to the motorcycle, to the small figure standing just inside the door, partially hidden behind Danny's frame, but still visible. A thin boy with a silver medallion around his neck, and brown eyes that were watching Dominic Slade with the focus of a camera recording evidence. "Who's the kid?" Slade asked. The temperature in the lot dropped 10 degrees. Jim shifted his body. A small movement, a half step to the right, an angling of the shoulders, that placed himself directly between Slade's line of sight and the garage door. It was instinctive, primal. The movement of a man positioning himself between a threat and something he has decided in the most fundamental part of his brain to protect. "Nobody you need to worry about," Jim said. "Garrett mentioned a kid. Said he's the one who fixed the bike. Said he knows things about Dutch's machines that nobody else knows." Slade's smile returned. "A kid like that, with that kind of knowledge, seems like he'd be valuable to a lot of people." The lot went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The difference between quiet and silent is the difference between a room where no one is talking and a room where no one is breathing. Jim took a step forward, one step. The same step he'd taken before, but different now. Heavier, slower, loaded with something that had moved beyond anger into a territory that didn't have a name because the language hadn't been invented for what happens inside a man when someone threatens a child he has claimed as his own. Dom. One syllable. Jim's voice had dropped below anything that should have been audible, but every person in that lot heard it with perfect clarity, the way you hear a click in a quiet room and know, without seeing, that the sound is a safety being released. "If you say another word about that boy, this conversation ends a different way, and you know what that way looks like." Slade's escorts shifted. The Reapers behind Jim tightened their line. The physics of the lot had changed. The space between the two groups had compressed, contracted, the 10 feet of gravel between them charged with enough potential energy to level the building. Slade raised both hands, palms out. Not surrender, but calibration. The gesture of a man adjusting his position without conceding it. "We'll be watching tomorrow, Jim. From a distance. Respectfully." "There is no respectful distance. There is only gone." Slade held Jim's stare for one more second. Then he turned, walked to his bike, mounted, and fired the engine. His two escorts followed. 3 sport bikes pulled out of the lot in a whine of high-revving Japanese steel, turned west on Industrial Row, and disappeared. The sound faded. The silence returned. But it was a different silence now. Charged, electric, humming with the residual energy of a confrontation that had ended in words but felt like it had ended in blood. Jim stood in the lot for 30 seconds after the Vipers disappeared. His back was to the garage. His hands were at his sides, opening and closing slowly. The repetitive motion of a man processing adrenaline through his fists because there was nowhere else for it to go. Then he turned around. He looked at his men. 21 faces, some angry, some scared, some vibrating with the post-confrontation high that comes from standing on the edge of violence without falling in. All of them waiting. "Garrett sold us out," Jim said. His voice was flat again, controlled. The operational voice. "He gave the Vipers our route, our numbers, our internal situation, and information about the boy. That makes him a threat to this club and a threat to a child under our protection." He paused. Let the words settle. Mace. A massive biker near the back of the group stepped forward. Mace was 6'4", 250, with a gray beard that reached his chest and hands the size of dinner plates. He was the club's sergeant at arms. His job description was exactly what it sounded like. "Find Garrett," Jim said. "Bring him to the clubhouse. Don't hurt him. Don't threaten him. Just bring him. I'll deal with it after the memorial. And if he doesn't want to come, he'll come. He's got nowhere else to go. The Vipers won't take him. He's used goods now, and Dom knows it. Garrett's alone. And alone is the worst thing a man like Garrett can be." Mace nodded and walked to his bike. Jim turned to Danny. "The bike stays here tonight. Nobody leaves the shop. I want eyes on that FXR every minute until we roll out tomorrow morning." "What about the Vipers?" "Dom's testing us. He wants to see if we flinch, if we change the route or cancel the ride or lock the bike away and hide." Jim shook his head. "We don't flinch. The ride goes as planned. Same route, same formation, same time. If Dom wants to watch, he can watch. And if he wants more than that," Jim left the sentence unfinished. He didn't need to finish it. Every man present could write the ending themselves. Jim walked into the garage. Leo was standing exactly where he'd been, just inside the door, the medallion hanging against his chest, his eyes following Jim with the watchful patience of someone who has just learned that the world he's entered has sharper edges than the one he left. Jim crouched in front of him, eye level, the same position he'd been in when he placed the medallion. But his face was different now, harder, more focused, the face of a man transitioning from ceremony to strategy. "You heard all of that," Jim said. "Yes." "You understand what it means. The man in the red vest wants to hurt the bike, and Garrett told him about me." "That's right. Am I in danger?" Jim looked at the boy for a long moment. He could have lied. He could have softened it. He could have done what adults do when they want to protect children from truths that are too large for small shoulders. He could have said, "No, you're safe. Nothing's going to happen." But Jim Mercer did not lie to people he respected. And he respected this boy more than he respected most of the men who wore his patch. "Yes," Jim said. "You are. And I'm going to make sure nothing comes of it. But I need you to do something for me." "What?" "Go home. Stay with your mother. Lock the doors. Don't come back to this shop until I send someone to get you. And if anyone you don't recognize shows up at your house, anyone, for any reason, you call this number." He pulled a card from his cut, plain white, a phone number written in pencil. Nothing else. Leo took the card, looked at it, looked at Jim. "Will the bike be okay?" Jim almost smiled. Almost. The scar twitched. "The bike's going to be fine. Danny and the boys will be here all night." "And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow your dad's work rides to the coast, and every reaper in this club will be behind it." Leo nodded. He tucked the card into his pocket with the careful deliberation of someone storing something precious. Then he turned and walked toward the parking lot, toward the dented gray Honda where Maria Hayes sat behind the wheel, watching everything through a windshield that needed replacing, her hands still gripping the steering wheel, her face carrying the particular expression of a mother who has just watched her only child receive a silver medallion from an outlaw biker and isn't sure whether to feel protected or terrified. Leo opened the passenger door, got in, closed the door. The Honda started with a sound that was the opposite of everything this garage represented. Quiet, practical, exhausted. The engine of a car that existed only to get from one obligation to the next. Maria backed out of the lot without looking at Jim, without looking at the reapers, without looking at the garage where her dead husband's legacy had just been weaponized by a rival club and her living son had just been named a target. The taillights disappeared around the corner. Jim watched them go. He stood in the lot until the sound of the Honda was gone, until the only sound left was the wind coming off the coast and the distant rumble of traffic on the overpass and the ticking of hot motorcycle engines cooling in the cold morning air. Then he turned to Danny. "Nobody sleeps tonight," Jim said. "Not until that bike is on the road." Danny nodded. They walked inside. The roll-up door came down with a metallic crash. the padlock engaged. The fluorescent lights buzzed on, the surviving four casting their sickly amber glow across the center bay, where Dutch Sullivan's FXR sat in absolute stillness, its engine cooling, its pipes still radiating heat, its frame holding the memory of a roar that had shaken the walls and cracked open a room full of men who had forgotten how to feel. Outside, darkness gathered over Ashland like a fist closing. The temperature dropped. Fog crept in from the coast, threading through the industrial district in pale ribbons that wrapped around streetlights and softened the edges of buildings, and turned Industrial Row into something that looked like a photograph of a place that no longer existed. Somewhere in that fog, Dominic Slade was making phone calls. Somewhere in that fog, Garrett Voss was running out of places to hide. And somewhere on Coulter Street, in a small rented house with one porch light and a screen door that didn't lock properly, an 8-year-old boy sat on his bed in the dark with a silver winged skull medallion pressed against his chest, listening to his mother crying in the next room, holding a white card with a phone number written in pencil, understanding, with a clarity no child should possess, that tomorrow morning would decide whether his father's legacy lived or died. The clock read 9:47 p.m. Friday night pressed against the windows of Apex Ironworks like something trying to get in. Inside, 21 men sat in the amber light, guarding a dead man's motorcycle, waiting for dawn. None of them knew if dawn would come quietly. Dawn came to Ashland at 5:51 a.m. on Saturday morning, and it came the way dawn comes to places that have been holding their breath all night. Slowly, reluctantly, as if the sun itself wasn't sure what it would find when the darkness pulled back. The fog had thickened overnight. It lay across Industrial Row in heavy sheets, turning the streetlights into pale orange ghosts and reducing visibility to 40 yards in every direction. The temperature was 49 degrees. The asphalt was slick with condensation. The air tasted like salt and diesel and the metallic edge of a Pacific cold front that had no intention of leaving. Inside Apex Ironworks, the fluorescent lights had been burning for 14 hours straight. 2 more tubes had died during the night, leaving only 2 functional. A pair of sickly amber bars that cast the garage in a light so dim the men inside had spent the last 3 hours navigating more by memory than by sight. Nobody had slept. Danny sat on an overturned bucket near the center bay, his back against the workbench, his eyes open but unfocused in the way of a man who had passed through exhaustion into the strange, brittle clarity that exists on the other side. His hands were wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. Beside him, Coop was asleep, sitting up in the folding chair, his head tilted back against the wall, his mouth slightly open, his red hair matted with grease and sweat. 11 Reapers were scattered through the garage in various states of consciousness, leaning against walls, sitting on tool cabinets, stretched across the concrete floor with leather cuts folded under their heads as pillows. The rest had taken shifts outside, patrolling the lot in pairs, walking the perimeter of the building in slow circles, watching the fog for shapes that didn't belong. Nothing had come. No Vipers. No Garrett. No trouble. But nobody believed the nothing. Nobody trusted it. In this world, nothing was just the space between two somethings, and the second something was always worse than the first. Jim hadn't sat down all night. He had spent the hours walking, slow laps around the interior of the garage, his boots following the same path along the perimeter, past the tool wall, past the parts bins, past the dead neon signs junction box, past the roll-up door, past the FXR, and back again. A circuit. A vigil. The repetitive motion of a man whose body needed movement because stillness would mean thinking, and thinking would mean feeling, and feeling, for Jim Mercer, was a door he had opened once last night, when the engine roared, and was not prepared to open again. Not yet. At 5:55, his phone buzzed, a text from Mace. 2 words. Got him. Jim read the message. His face didn't change. He pocketed the phone and walked to the roll-up door. Danny? Danny's eyes refocused. Yeah. Wake everybody up. We roll in 30 minutes. The garage came alive with the slow, stiff movements of men who had spent the night on concrete. Joints cracked, backs straightened with audible pops. Cigarettes were lit. Someone found a can of coffee grounds and got the ancient machine in the corner running, and the smell of cheap coffee filled the space like a small act of mercy in a room that had seen none. Jim opened the roll-up door. Fog poured in, cold and thick, carrying the smell of the coast. The gravel lot was gray and wet. The reapers' motorcycles sat in a line along the fence, chrome beaded with moisture, leather seats dark with dew. At 6:15, the rest of the club arrived. They came from every direction, solo riders and groups of 2 and 3, materializing out of the fog like something from a dream about war. Headlights cut through the gray. Engines announced themselves one by one, each new arrival adding another voice to a chorus that built slowly, steadily, until the lot held 46 motorcycles, and the collective rumble was loud enough to vibrate the building's foundation. 46, not 47. The missing bike was Garrett Voss's. The men assembled in the lot without instructions. They knew the formation. They knew the route. They knew their positions because they had ridden this kind of ride before. Not for Dutch specifically, but for others, for the dead who had earned the road. And the choreography of grief was so deeply embedded in their muscle memory that it required no rehearsal. At 6:22, a dented gray Honda Civic pulled into the far corner of the lot. Maria Hayes got out of the driver's side. She was wearing a black jacket over dark jeans and boots that looked new, the kind of boots a woman buys when she knows she'll be standing for a long time and wants to stand properly. Her hair was down. Her face was composed, but her eyes were swollen in the way that reveals a night spent crying in the dark after her son had fallen asleep. Leo got out of the passenger side. He was wearing clean clothes, a dark blue t-shirt that actually fit, jeans that weren't cuffed, sneakers that had been scrubbed. The silver medallion hung outside his shirt, visible, resting against his chest. He had combed his hair. All of it this time, front and back. He looked like a boy who had dressed himself with intention for the first time in a long time, and the intention was respect. Maria walked him to the edge of the lot. She stopped. She looked at the 46 motorcycles, the 46 men in leather, the fog curling around their boots, and she held Leo's hand with a grip that said everything her mouth refused to say. Jim walked to them. "Mrs. Hayes?" "Maria," she said. "If my son is riding with you today, you can use my name." Jim nodded. "He won't be on a bike. He'll ride in Rusty's truck at the back of the formation. Rusty's driving. Danny's in the passenger seat." "And you?" "I ride Dutch's FXR at the front." Maria looked at the garage where the motorcycle was visible through the open door, sitting in the center bay, silent and massive and somehow more present than anything else in the lot. "My husband loved that machine," she said, "more than he should have, more than was healthy. But he loved it the way he loved everything, quietly, completely, without expecting anything back." She looked at Jim. "Bring it home in one piece." "I will." "And bring my son home in one piece." "I will." She released Leo's hand. She didn't hug him, not in front of these men, not in this moment, not with 46 pairs of eyes watching, but she touched his face. One touch. Her palm against his cheek, her thumb brushing the corner of his eye. A gesture so small and so infinite that every man in the lot who had ever been loved by a mother felt it in his own chest. Then she walked to her car, got in, and sat behind the wheel. She would follow the formation in the Honda. She would stay at the back, behind Rusty's truck, behind the last bike in the line. She would follow her son and her husband's legacy to the coast and back, and she would do it in a car that cost less than any single motorcycle in the procession. And she would not complain, and she would not explain, and she would not apologize for being exactly who she was. Jim walked the FXR out of the garage. He rolled it through the door and into the lot on its kickstand, the tires leaving dark tracks in the wet gravel. The fog wrapped around the machine as if welcoming it. In the gray morning light, the flat black paint seemed to absorb the world. Every photon of available light disappearing into the surface, giving the bike the appearance of a shadow that had learned to exist in 3 dimensions. Jim mounted. His weight settled into the frame. His hands found the grips. His boots found the pegs. His right thumb found the starter button. He didn't hesitate. The engine fired on the first press. The roar split the morning fog like a blade through cloth. That deep, uneven, hand-built thunder rolled across the lot and over the rooftops of Industrial Row and into the streets of Ashland with enough force to wake every sleeping dog and every sleeping conscience within a half-mile. The pipes barked fire. The frame shook. The engine settled into its signature idle. The heartbeat, the poem, the mechanical fingerprint of Dutch Sullivan encoded in camshaft profiles and compression ratios and timing marks filed by hand in a garage that no longer existed. 46 other engines fired in sequence. The sound was cumulative, building, layering, until the collective rumble of 47 Harleys created a vibration that could be felt in the ground itself, a seismic event measured not in magnitude but in meaning. Jim pulled out of the lot first. The FXR led. Behind him, the formation assembled, 2 by 2, staggered, tight, 46 bikes moving in synchronized precision through the fog. At the rear, Rusty's truck. Leo sat in the back seat of the extended cab, his face pressed against the window, the medallion clutched in his right hand, watching the formation stretch out ahead of him like a river of chrome and leather flowing toward the coast. Behind the truck, Maria's Honda. Alone. Following. The route was 37 miles. West through the industrial district, south on Route 4 past the refinery stacks, then west again on the coastal highway until the road ran out at Shelter Point, a rocky overlook above the Pacific where Dutch Sullivan had told Jim years ago that it was the only place in California where the wind sounded honest. They rode in silence, not mechanical silence. The engines were deafening, 47 V-twins creating a rolling wall of sound that preceded the convoy by a quarter mile and followed it by half. But human silence. No hand signals beyond the necessary. No gestures. No communication except the shared, unspoken agreement of 47 men riding together toward a place where they would say goodbye to someone they could never replace. The fog thinned as they climbed the coastal highway. The ocean appeared to the left, a vast, gray, restless expanse that merged with the sky at a horizon line so faint it looked painted. Seabirds wheeled overhead. The wind off the water was cold and clean and carried the smell of kelp and salt, and the particular emptiness that exists only at the edge of a continent. They passed the refinery stacks. They passed the abandoned cannery. They passed the turnoff for Route 112, the road where Arthur Hayes had died. And when the formation passed that turnoff, something happened that nobody had planned and nobody would ever take credit for organizing. Every rider, in unison, revved his engine once. One collective roar, one thunderclap of exhaust and combustion that echoed off the hillside and rolled down toward the highway and disappeared into the fog below. A salute, a recognition, an acknowledgement that the road beneath their tires had taken someone from them and they were riding over his grave and they would not pass in silence. In Rusty's truck, Leo pressed his forehead against the window and closed his eyes. His lips moved, forming words no one could hear. Maybe his father's name. Maybe a timing specification. Maybe both. In Leo's world, the two had always been the same thing. They reached Shelter Point at 7:48 a.m. The overlook was a gravel clearing on a bluff 100 feet above the Pacific. No guardrail. No amenities. No sign. Just a flat patch of earth and rock at the end of a narrow road where the wind blew constant and hard, and the sound of waves breaking against the cliff face below created a rhythm that was older than anything human and would continue long after every man present was gone. 47 motorcycles parked in a semicircle facing the ocean. Engines died. The wind took over, a steady, salt-heavy gust that pushed against leather cuts and flattened pant legs and made eyes water in a way that could be blamed on weather. Jim dismounted the FXR and walked it to the center of the semicircle. He set the kickstand. He stepped back. The motorcycle stood alone, facing the Pacific. The fog had burned off enough to let through a weak silver light that caught the chrome, what little chrome remained, and gave the flat black paint a faint sheen, a luminosity, as if the machine was generating its own light from somewhere inside. Nobody had written a speech. Nobody had prepared remarks. That wasn't how the Iron Reapers said goodbye. They said goodbye the way they said everything, with silence and proximity and the unspoken understanding that some debts can only be paid by showing up. Jim stood beside the FXR for a long time. His face was turned toward the ocean. The wind pushed his hair back from the scar. His hands were at his sides, empty, open. The hands of a man who had nothing left to hold and was learning in real time what it felt like to let go. Then he spoke. Not loudly, not to the crowd, just to the wind and the bike and whatever remained of the man who had built it. You told me not to let her rot. I almost did. Took me 19 days and an 8-year-old kid to figure out what you already knew. That you can't read the poem if you don't learn the language. Arthur learned it. His boy learned it. I'm still learning. He paused. The waves crashed below. A seabird screamed somewhere in the fog. I should have answered the phone, Dutch. Not Garrett. Me. I should have been the one who picked up when Arthur called. I should have driven to that shop myself and put his bike in the truck and brought him home. But I didn't, because I was busy. Because I had club business. Because I made the same mistake Garrett made. I decided that the people who keep us alive aren't as important as the things that keep us busy. His voice cracked. Just once. A hairline fracture in the granite. I'm done making that mistake. He stepped back. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The words had been small and rough and imperfect, and they were exactly enough. May stepped forward next, then another reaper, then another. One by one, the men approached the motorcycle and stood beside it for a moment, some touching the handlebars, some touching the seat, some just standing close enough to feel the residual heat that still radiated from the engine block like a body that hadn't finished cooling. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The motorcycle was the language, and standing beside it was the sentence, and the sentence said, I was here. I remember. I'm sorry. Leo was last. He walked from Rusty's truck to the center of the semicircle with the careful, measured steps of someone crossing a threshold they know they can't cross back over. The wind hit him full force. He was so small it nearly staggered him, and he leaned into it the way his father must have leaned into headwinds on the highway, finding the angle where resistance becomes balance. He stood beside the FXR. He placed both hands on the gas tank, palms flat, fingers spread, the way a doctor places hands on a patient's chest to feel for a heartbeat. He stood like that for a long time. Eyes closed. Face turned toward the wind. The medallion swung against his chest in the gusts. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't crying. He was past crying. He was in the place that exists after tears, the quiet country on the far side of grief where the landscape is flat and empty and strangely peaceful because everything that needed to be lost has been lost, and what remains is only what you chose to keep. I hear you, Dad, he said, quietly, to the motorcycle, to the wind, to the place where memory and metal meet and become the same thing. I hear you. He stepped back. The formation held for another 10 minutes. 47 men and one boy standing on a cliff above the Pacific, the fog dissolving around them, the sun breaking through in pale columns that hit the water and turned it from gray to silver to a blue so deep it looked like the ocean was showing them something it usually kept hidden. Then Jim mounted the FXR, and the formation remounted. And 47 engines fired in the cold coastal air, and the sound rolled down the cliff face and mixed with the waves and became part of the ocean's rhythm, temporary and permanent at the same time, the way all human sounds are when they're made with enough intention. They rode back. The return was slower, quieter in the human sense, though the engines were just as loud. The fog burned off completely by the time they reached Route 4, and the sun, pale, winter weak but present, cast long shadows beside the formation that stretched across the highway like a parallel convoy made of darkness. They passed the Route 112 turnoff again. This time nobody revved. This time the acknowledgement was silence. A collective held breath, 47 men passing a grave marker at 50 miles an hour with their jaws set and their eyes forward and their throttle hands steady. They reached Ashland at 9:30 a.m., The formation rolled back onto Industrial Row and into the lot at Apex Ironworks, and the engines died for the last time, and the last echo of the last exhaust note faded into a morning that was finally, fully, irreversibly over. Jim parked the FXR in the center bay. He killed the engine. He sat on the bike for a moment, alone, his hands still on the grips, his body still vibrating with the residual frequency of the ride. Then he dismounted and walked outside. The lot was full of men and machines and the low murmur of conversation that happens after funerals. The quiet, aimless talk of people who have just done something heavy and need the sound of ordinary voices to bring them back to ordinary ground. Maria's Honda was parked at the edge of the lot. She was leaning against the driver's door with her arms crossed, watching Leo, who was standing among the reapers as if he'd always been there, small, serious, listening to the men talk with the attentive silence of someone memorizing everything. Jim walked to Maria. He stood beside her, both of them facing the lot, both of them watching Leo. "Rusty wants to offer him an apprenticeship," Jim said. "After school, weekends, paid. He'd learn the trade, properly." Maria didn't respond immediately. She watched her son. A reaper named Tommy, young, early 20s, a quiet kid with a limp from a construction accident, was showing Leo something on his motorcycle, pointing at the engine, explaining. Leo was nodding. His hand was on the chrome. His face was focused, intent, alive in a way that Maria hadn't seen since Arthur died. "And the club?" she asked. "The club pays for his education. When he's 18, if he wants to go to engineering school, the money's there. No strings, no expectations, no patch required. And if someone like Garrett's been removed from the club, permanently. His patch was pulled this morning. He's gone." "And the Vipers?" Jim was quiet for a moment. The morning sun was warm on his face, but his eyes were cold with the particular clarity of a man who has spent all night preparing for a war that didn't come, and knows, with certainty, that the preparation itself was the deterrent. Dom Slade watched the ride from the highway overpass on Route 4. I saw him. He saw me see him. He saw 47 bikes in tight formation moving as one unit, and he understood something that his phone call with Garrett didn't tell him, that this club is not falling apart. This club just buried its president and rode his motorcycle to the coast and brought it back and did all of it without flinching. Dom is many things, but he's not stupid. He'll find easier territory. Maria considered this. Her arms tightened across her chest. "You can't guarantee that." "No, I can't. But I can guarantee that your son and you are under the protection of every man in this lot. And that protection is not conditional. It's not temporary. It's not dependent on Leo fixing motorcycles or carrying his father's knowledge or being useful to us in any way. It exists because Arthur gave us 19 years and we gave him nothing, and that debt doesn't expire." Maria turned her head and looked at Jim directly. For the first time, her eyes were not angry, not afraid, not guarded. They were something else, something tired and cautiously, fractionally, almost imperceptibly willing to believe that the world might contain one more decent thing than she had budgeted for. "He's going to want to be here every day," she said. "You know that." "I know." "He's going to learn things I can't teach him and become someone I don't fully understand." "Probably." "And he's going to carry Arthur's legacy in ways that I can't control." "Yes." Maria looked at the lot again. At Leo, at the men surrounding him, at the motorcycles and the leather and the fog-damp gravel and the neon sign that still couldn't spell its own name. "3 conditions," she said. "Name them." "He does his homework before he touches a wrench. He's home for dinner every night. And if anything ever makes me feel like my son is not safe, I pull him out and none of you argue." "Done." "I mean it, Jim. No argument, no guilt, no pressure. I say he's out. He's out." "I heard you the first time." "Done." Maria uncrossed her arms. She didn't extend her hand. She didn't smile. But something in her posture released. A tension that had been holding her body in a defensive configuration for 14 months. A structural rigidity that had kept her upright through grief and poverty and single parenthood, and the daily grinding labor of pretending to be strong enough for 2 parents when she was barely strong enough for one. She wasn't letting go. She was adjusting. Making room for something she hadn't expected to find in a gravel parking lot surrounded by outlaw bikers on a Saturday morning in Ashland, California. Room for help. Room for people who owed her a debt and were, for the first time, actually trying to pay it. Rusty came out of the garage. He walked to Leo, crouched beside him, and said something quiet that made the boy look up with an expression that cracked every heart in a 30-foot radius. Leo nodded, then nodded again, then looked over at his mother. Maria nodded once, just once. A small movement, an enormous permission. Leo turned back to Rusty, and for the first time in this entire story, the first time since he'd stepped out of the shadows holding a push broom in a failing garage on a hot Thursday afternoon, Leo smiled. It was a small smile, tentative, rusty. A smile that didn't quite trust itself yet, that was testing the muscles it would need and finding them stiff from disuse. But it was there, visible, real. The smile of a boy who had spent 14 months carrying his father's death like a stone in his chest and had finally, in this moment, in this unlikely place, among these improbable people, found somewhere to set it down. Not forever. Grief doesn't work that way. The stone would return. It would be heavy again. There would be nights when the weight would feel impossible, and mornings when the absence of his father's voice would echo through the house like a sound that had forgotten how to stop. But today, in this lot, with grease under his fingernails and a silver medallion against his heart, and the ghost of a resurrected engine still ringing in his ears, today the stone was down, and Leo was standing straight, and the sun was breaking through. Jim walked back to the FXR one last time. He stood beside it in the center bay of Apex Ironworks alone, the rest of the club dispersing in the lot behind him, the sound of conversation and engines fading into the Saturday morning routine of men returning to their lives. He placed his hand on the gas tank. The metal was cold now. The engine was silent. The fire was out. But the poem was still there, written in cam profiles and timing marks and hand-filed notches and hidden toggle switches and a secondary bypass that only a child's hand could reach. Written in a language that Dutch Sullivan had invented and Arthur Hayes had translated and Leo Hayes had inherited. A language of steel and precision and love disguised as engineering. Jim's hand lingered on the tank for a moment. Then he stepped back. He turned off the remaining lights. He walked out of the garage and pulled the roll-up door down and locked it with the padlock that Rusty had given him. A gesture of trust from a man who had spent 22 years guarding this building and was now handing the key to someone he'd been afraid of 48 hours ago. The lot was nearly empty. Danny and Coop were loading tools into Rusty's truck. A few reapers lingered near their bikes, smoking, talking in low voices, reluctant to leave the way people are reluctant to leave a place where something important has happened. Leo was sitting on the curb beside his mother's Honda, eating a breakfast sandwich that someone, Tommy probably, had brought him from the gas station down the street. Maria sat beside him. Their shoulders were touching. They weren't talking. They were just sitting together in the weak morning sun, eating, existing, being alive in a world that had taken the most important person from both of them and impossibly had given them something back. Not a replacement, not a fix, not a happy ending tied with a bow and delivered by men on motorcycles. Just a place. A small, imperfect, oil-stained place where a boy could learn the language his father spoke, surrounded by flawed men who had failed Arthur Hayes in life and were trying, clumsily, imperfectly, with more sincerity than skill, to honor him in death. Jim mounted his own bike. Not the FXR, his bike. His worn, scarred, road-weary Harley that had carried him through 3 decades of a life he'd never planned and couldn't imagine leaving. He fired the engine. The sound was familiar, personal, the mechanical equivalent of his own voice. Rough, low, reliable, carrying more weight than it showed. He pulled out of the lot. He turned east on Industrial Row. He rode. Behind him, Ashland woke up. Traffic filled the streets. Store signs flickered on. The city resumed its ordinary rhythms, unaware that 47 motorcycles had just carried a dead man's memory to the edge of the continent and brought it back, and that somewhere inside a locked garage on Industrial Row, a 1986 Harley-Davidson FXR sat in the darkness with a cold engine and a warm legacy, waiting for the next pair of hands that understood its language. And on a curb in a gravel parking lot, an 8-year-old boy finished his breakfast sandwich, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked up at his mother with brown eyes that were, for the first time in 14 months, not carrying the full weight of the world alone. "Can we come back Monday?" he asked. Maria looked at the garage, at the locked door, at the dead neon sign. At the gravel lot where the tire marks of 47 motorcycles were still pressed into the wet earth like signatures on a contract nobody had written down. "Yeah," she said. "We can come back Monday." Leo leaned against her shoulder. Maria put her arm around him. They sat on the curb in the morning sun, two people in a parking lot on the wrong side of a city that had never been kind to them, and for the first time since the phone call at midnight 14 months ago, the world felt like it might have room for them after all. Not much room, not easy room, not the kind of room that comes with guarantees or comfort or certainty, but room. And sometimes that's enough.